Hello, friend. Wherever you are right now, curled up in bed, stretched out on a couch, staring at a ceiling in the dark, I'm glad you're here. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment if you're awake enough. But if you're drifting, that's perfectly fine too. That's what we're here for. Tonight, we're traveling north, far north, to a place where winter nights stretched endlessly, where the sea crashed against jagged cliffs, and where the boundary between the living world and the realm of gods felt thin as morning mist. We're going to the lands of the Norse people, the Scandinavians who inhabited what we now call Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. But we're not just visiting a place. We're entering a world of stories, a vast interconnected web of myths that explained everything from the creation of the cosmos to the taste of poetry, from why the sun moves across the sky to what happens when you die in battle. Picture it. The late 8th century, perhaps, though these stories are far older than that. A longhouse on the edge of a Norwegian fjord. Outside, the wind howls across black water. Inside, firelight flickers against wooden walls, and people gather close, not just for warmth, but for something else. Stories. A skald, a poet-historian, begins to speak, not reading because many of these tales weren't written down yet. Speaking from memory, from training, from a tradition passed down through generations like a precious inheritance. These weren't just entertainment, though they certainly entertained. They were history, religion, law, and philosophy all woven together. They explained how the world worked and why things were the way they were. They provided models for how to live and how to die. They answered the questions that keep humans awake at night. Where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? Is there meaning to any of this? The Norse cosmos, as we'll discover, was not a place of eternal certainty or divine perfection. It was temporary, fragile even. The gods themselves knew that everything would end, that a final battle called Ragnarok would destroy the world they'd built. They knew this and they kept going anyway, kept fighting, kept creating, kept living. There's something profound in that, something that spoke to the people who told these stories as they faced their own harsh realities. Brutal winters, dangerous seas, violent conflicts, short lives. But here's what makes this mythology so rich. It wasn't one story. It was hundreds, thousands of interlocking tales, some grand and cosmic, others small and strange. Gods who weren't all-powerful but deeply flawed. Giants who were sometimes enemies, sometimes lovers, sometimes both. Worlds stacked on top of each other, connected by a cosmic tree. Magic that came with terrible costs. Prophecies that couldn't be avoided. Heroes who knew they were doomed but fought anyway. We know these stories from several sources, though much was lost. The most important are the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in Iceland, and the Prose Edda, written by an Icelandic scholar named Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, long after Christianity had replaced the old beliefs. Snorri was trying to preserve what remained, to capture the mythology before it disappeared completely. He succeeded, though we'll never know how much was already gone by his time, how many stories died with the last people who believed them. What we're about to explore isn't just ancient history. These myths have survived, evolved, been reinterpreted countless times. They influenced everything from medieval literature to modern fantasy novels, from Wagner's operas to Marvel movies. But tonight, we're going back to the source, to the original shape of these stories as best we can reconstruct them. Why does this matter? Because these myths were attempts to understand the same fundamental mysteries we still grapple with. Because they created frameworks for meaning that sustained entire cultures for centuries. Because they're beautiful and strange and haunting. Because understanding how the Norse imagined their cosmos helps us understand how humans everywhere have tried to make sense of existence. So settle in. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want, or keep them half open on the screen. We have a long journey ahead, through ice and fire, through 9 worlds, through the birth and death of everything. We'll meet gods who drink and scheme and love and betray. We'll witness creation and destruction. We'll explore a universe that feels both utterly alien and strangely familiar. Now, let's begin at the very beginning, before there were gods or worlds, before there was anything at all except emptiness and the promise of what might come. In the beginning, there was nothing, but not the peaceful, serene nothing you might imagine. Not blank whiteness or comfortable darkness. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the yawning void. And the word itself sounds like emptiness, like something opening wide and hungry. It was a gap, a chasm, an absence so profound it had its own terrible presence. But even in this primordial void, forces were gathering at opposite edges. To the north lay Niflheim, the world of ice and mist. Imagine it. A realm of endless frozen fog, where cold rivers called Ilivigar flowed from a spring named Vergelmer. These weren't gentle streams but torrents of poison and ice, and as they flowed farther from their source, they froze, layer upon layer, building up in the void. The cold there wasn't just physical, it was absolute, cosmic, the negation of all warmth and life. Datio the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire. If Niflheim was negation, Muspelheim was violent affirmation. Flames that consumed everything, heat that could melt stone, sparks that flew upward into the darkness like angry stars. This wasn't the comforting fire of a hearth. This was primordial fire, the kind that precedes all order, all control. And guarding this realm stood Searcher, a figure we'll meet again at the end of everything. A giant with a flaming sword who waits, patient and eternal, for his moment to burn the world. Now picture these two forces meeting in Ginnungagap. Ice flowing south, fire reaching north, and where they touched, something happened. The ice began to melt, drops of water formed, and in those drops, in that meeting of absolute opposites, life stirred. The first being to emerge was Ymir, the primordial giant. Not born in any conventional sense, but formed, coalesced from the melting ice and the heat of fire. Ymir was enormous beyond comprehension, and he was neither good nor evil. He simply was a force of raw existence. While he slept, he sweated, and from that sweat came more giants. From under his left arm grew a male and female, and his legs produced a 6-headed son. This is how the race of frost giants began, not through intention or design, but through the unconscious processes of the first being's body. But Ymir needed sustenance, and in the melting ice, another creature formed, Ambla, the primordial cow. She fed Ymir with rivers of milk that flowed from her udders, for streams that sustained the first giant. And what did Ambla eat? She licked the salty ice blocks, slowly, patiently, with her great tongue. Here's where it gets interesting. As Ambla licked the ice, something emerged. On the first day, hair appeared. On the second day, a head. On the third day, an entire man stepped free from the ice. His name was Buri, and he was beautiful and strong and entirely different from Ymir and his giant descendants. Buri was the first of a new race, the race that would become the gods. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor married a giantess named Bestla. Yes, even in the beginning, the gods and giants intermingled, their bloodlines crossing in ways that would matter later. Bor and Bestla had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Vi. These 3 brothers would change everything. The brothers looked at Ymir, at the endless reproduction of frost giants, and they made a decision. The reasons aren't entirely clear in the surviving texts. Perhaps they saw Ymir and his offspring as a threat. Perhaps they envisioned something better than the chaos of the early cosmos. Perhaps they were simply driven by the impulse that would define them, the desire to create, to order, to shape. They attacked Ymir. The 3 brothers together brought down the first being, and when they killed him, his blood flowed so profusely it drowned almost all the frost giants. Only one escaped, Bergelmir, who fled with his wife in a boat fashioned from a hollowed tree trunk, riding the waves of Ymir's blood until they found refuge. From these two survivors, all future generations of giants would descend, carrying with them an eternal grudge against the gods who murdered their ancestor. But Odin, Vili, and Ve weren't finished. They looked at Ymir's massive corpse and saw not death but potential. In an act of cosmic recycling that would set the pattern for Norse cosmology, they decided to make the world from the giant's body. They dragged the corpse into the center of Ginnungagap and began their work. From Ymir's flesh, they shaped the earth solid, vast, the foundation of everything. From his blood, they made the seas and lakes, all the waters that would surround and flow through the world. His bones became mountains, rising high and jagged against the sky. His teeth and fragments of broken bone became rocks and stones scattered across the land. His hair transformed into trees and vegetation, forests that would cover the earth's surface. They took his skull and raised it high, creating the dome of the sky, and they positioned four dwarfs, Nori, Suri, Austri, and Vestri, whose names simply meant north, south, east, and west, at the four corners to hold it up. From Ymir's brains, they made clouds, gray and white and heavy with moisture. Even the giant's eyebrows found purpose. The brothers shaped them into walls that would encircle and protect the middle realm, the world where humans would eventually live. They called this protected space Midgard, Middle Earth, but the cosmos wasn't complete. The brothers looked at the sparks and embers floating up from Muspelheim and gave them purpose too. They placed them in the sky as stars, some fixed in their positions, others wandering. They took two particularly bright embers and set them on paths across the heavens. One became the sun, the other the moon, and they would travel endlessly, giving light and marking time. Yet even this wasn't arbitrary or mechanical. The brothers created chariots for the sun and moon, and they needed drivers. A man named Mundalfari had two beautiful children, so beautiful he named them after the celestial bodies. Sol for the sun, Mani for the moon. The gods, offended by such presumption, took the children and made the names real. Sol would drive the sun chariot, Mani the moon, and they would race across the sky forever. But why race? Because they were being chased. Two wolves, Skoll and Hati, pursued them endlessly, hungry, relentless. This is why the sun moves so quickly across the sky, why it never stops. It's running. And one day, the myths tell us, at the time of Ragnarok, these wolves will finally catch their prey. The sun will be devoured. The moon will be swallowed. But that day hasn't come yet. From the beginning, you see, the Norse cosmos was built on repurposed death, on transformation, on the principle that nothing is wasted and everything connects to everything else. The world itself was a body. The sky was a skull. Time and light were prisoners in an eternal chase. And underlying it all was the memory of that first violence, that first choice to kill and create, a choice that would echo through every story that followed. So now there is a world. Earth from flesh, sea from blood, mountains from bone, sky from skull. Stars burn. The sun and moon run their frightened circuits across the heavens. But a world like this, no matter how carefully arranged, is still just a stage. It needs actors. It needs beings who walk and think and wonder. The three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve, understood this. They had already committed themselves to this role of shapers, designers of reality. They had killed the first being and turned his body into structure. Now they wanted life within that structure, life that was more than giants and gods, more than the raw forces of chaos and power. One day, the three brothers were walking along the shore of a new-formed sea, somewhere near the edge of Midgard. Imagine that for a moment. The air still carrying the scent of salt and something faintly metallic, like blood, from the birth of the oceans. The land still raw and unfamiliar, the sky oddly close, as if the world hadn't quite settled into its final shape. Waves lapped at the sand, and driftwood lay scattered on the shore. Pieces of trees that had once been Ymir's hair. The brothers paused when they saw two fallen trunks. One was ash, tall and straight, even in death. The other was elm, a little more slender, a little more flexible. There was nothing special about these pieces of wood. Not yet. They were just objects. Smooth in places, rough in others, bleached a little by the sun and sea spray. But Odin and his brothers saw potential. They stood over the two logs and decided to make something new. Something that had not existed before in this cosmos. Odin, the eldest and already the most driven by hunger for knowledge and meaning, gave them breath, life itself, the invisible spark that separates the living from the dead. Vili, whose name is tied to will and consciousness, gave them mind and movement, the ability to think, to decide, to act. Ve, associated with sacredness and form, gave them shape, senses, speech, and outward appearance. The logs changed. Limbs emerged, fingers and toes, a curve of spine, a face formed, then another, eyes opening to see a world that had never seen their kind before. Hair grew, skin warmed, lungs filled with air for the first time. They were no longer wood. They were people. The gods named the man Ask and the woman Embla. Ask, the ash tree, and Embla, often associated with elm or vine. These were the first humans, the ancestors of all humankind in Norse myth. The gods gave them clothes and a place to live, inside the protective wall made from Ymir's eyebrows, that ring of safety that separated Midgard from the wild, dangerous outer regions of the cosmos. And just like that, humans entered the story. For the Norse, this origin story said something quiet but profound. Humans are shaped from something ordinary and given something extraordinary. We're made from driftwood, basically raw material, simple, not glamorous, but bestowed with breath, thought, and form by divine action. It also makes clear from the beginning that humans are not at the center of the universe. We're placed in the middle realm, yes, but surrounded above, below, and around by forces greater and older than us. The cosmos itself took on a more intricate structure now. At the center stood Yggdrasil, the world tree. Try to picture it. Not a normal tree, but something that stretches across realities. Its branches extend over the heavens. Its roots sink deep into realms unseen. It is alive, but also cosmic architecture. Around and within this vast structure, the 9 worlds exist. Asgard, home of the Aesir gods. Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods. Midgard, human world, the middle realm. Jotunheim, land of the giants. Alfheim, home of the light elves. Svartalfheim or Nidavellir, realms associated with dark elves or dwarfs. Niflheim, world of ice and mist. Muspelheim, world of fire. Hell, the underworld of the dead. The texts differ on details, but the idea is consistent. Multiple. Realms interconnected, not neatly separated like boxes, but woven together like threads. Yggdrasil's roots touched 3 major wells. At one root lay Erdrbrunnr, the well of fate, where the Norns Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld sat and wove or carved destiny. Past, present, and future, though in Norse thought those aren't separate in the way modern minds like to imagine. Another root reached for Gelmir in Niflheim, source of many rivers. The third touched Mimisbrunnr, Mimir's well, a place of deep wisdom and hidden knowledge. Already a system was forming, not a neat, bureaucratic system like a modern state, but a mythic system, relationships, roles, and balances. The gods and giants had their realms. Humans had theirs. The dead had theirs. The cosmos was layered, with boundaries that could be crossed but never ignored. Above all of this, the Aesir gods began to organize themselves. Odin, with his brothers, had led the creation of the world. Naturally, he took a central position. He became All-Father, not because he created everything alone, but because he assumed responsibility for the order of things. He gathered a company of gods in Asgard, a fortified realm connected to Midgard by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost. This bridge, shimmering with colors yet dangerous to cross, symbolized both connection and separation between gods and humans. Asgard itself came with halls and homes that reflected the characters of the gods. Odin's hall, Valisjaf, had a high seat called Hliskjolf, from which he could see into all worlds. This is important. Odin was not omniscient by nature. He had to seek knowledge, work for it, sacrifice for it. But he also arranged things so he could watch, observe, and learn. Alongside Odin, other gods took shape. Thor, his son, with his hammer Mjolnir and red beard, protector of gods and humans against giants. Frey and Freya, twin siblings associated with fertility, prosperity, love, and magic. Tyr, a god of law and war, brave and honorable. Loki, the trickster, born of giants but living among the gods, unsettling everything he touched. Balder, the bright and beloved one. Heimdall, ever-watchful guardian of Bifrost. This growing divine community began to mirror aspects of human society. They had meetings, councils, disputes. They made decisions together, not always wisely. They had feasts and celebrations. They built halls like Gladsheim and Vingolf, places of assembly. There was hierarchy, but not absolute tyranny. Odin led, but he debated, negotiated, and sometimes manipulated. Humans, meanwhile, began to live their lives in Midgard. Norse mythology doesn't dwell much on the early organization of human society in the way a modern historian might, but embedded in the myths and sagas are clues. People lived in extended families or clans, governed by chieftains or kings whose authority rested on honor, strength, and the ability to give and receive gifts. Honor, or drengskapur, mattered intensely. Reputation outlived the body. To die with courage was better than to live in cowardice. Daily life for early Norse societies revolved around farming, fishing, herding, and seasonal cycles. Long houses of wood and turf, smoke curling from roof holes, the scent of cured fish, wool, and wet earth, tools of iron and bone, simple clothes against the cold, long winters that invited not just hardship, but storytelling. This is when the myths lived their fullest life, passed from mouth to ear by firelight. Religion at this stage wasn't centralized doctrine. It was practice. Sacrifices at groves, offerings at stones and mounds, charms spoken over weapons, ships, and fields. There were local cults, local favorites among the gods. Thor seems to have been especially popular among farmers and common folk, while Odin attracted poets, warriors, and those who sought knowledge at any cost. Already, an important relationship had formed. Humans needed the gods, and the gods, in a way, needed humans. Not for worship in the abstract sense, but for energy, alliance, continuation. Sacrifices, sometimes of animals, sometimes in darker stories of humans, maintained the balance, kept favor flowing. In return, gods offered protection, prosperity, or at least the chance of them to so. In this early phase of the Norse mythic cosmos, we see foundations laid. A created world built from an act of cosmic violence, a structured universe of 9 interconnected realms, a divine community beginning to organize itself in Asgard. Humans emerging as fragile but significant players, given life and a protected home, a system of relationships. Gods to giants, gods to humans, humans to fate. Everything is in place. Now for the next step. The consolidation of power, the shaping of lasting institutions and identities, especially through one of the most important conflicts in Norse myth, the war between the Aesir and the Vanir. Now, let's move into that next phase. The gods had built a world. They had made humans. They had established Asgard as their stronghold, a place of gleaming halls and high walls. But power, even divine power, is never fully secure. It must be tested, defended, negotiated. And in the Norse cosmos, that consolidation came through conflict, specifically through war with another family of gods entirely. The Aesir weren't alone in claiming divinity. There existed another tribe of gods called the Vanir, and they were different in fundamental ways. The Aesir, led by Odin, were associated with war, rulership, wisdom, death, the hard, sharp edges of existence. The Vanir were gods of fertility, prosperity, peace, and natural abundance. They included Njrr, god of the sea and wealth, his son Freyr, god of sunshine, rain, and harvests, and his daughter Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and a particular kind of magic called seer. Where the Aesir valued honor and martial prowess, the Vanir seemed to embody sensuality and earthly pleasures. Where the Aesir built fortresses, the Vanir cultivated fields and orchards. This wasn't just difference, it was tension, the kind that eventually ignites. The war between the Aesir and Vanir is one of the most important events in Norse mythology, though the sources give us frustratingly few details about how it actually started. What we know is this: a woman named Gullveig came to Asgard. She was associated with gold, with greed, with a kind of corrupting desire for wealth. Some scholars think she might have been a Vanir goddess, perhaps even Freya under another name. Others see her as a separate figure, a catalyst. The Aesir didn't like what she represented or what she said or perhaps what she did. The texts are vague. Their response was brutal and telling. They tried to kill her. They speared her. They burned her in their hall, not once but 3 times. And 3 times, Gullveig came back, reborn from the flames, until she took on a new name, Air, meaning bright or honor. Though perhaps ironically, this attempted murder and the magic that defied it, sparked war. The Vanir, outraged by the Aesir's treatment of Gullveig, attacked. The walls of Asgard, so carefully built, were breached. Battle raged across the cosmos, gods against gods, each side wielding their particular strengths. The Aesir threw spears and charged with shields. The Vanir used their magic, their connection to natural forces, their ability to bless or curse fertility and fortune. Neither side could win decisively. The war dragged on, costly and increasingly pointless, until both tribes grew weary of the bloodshed, so they did something remarkably pragmatic. They made peace, not through total surrender or domination, but through negotiation and the exchange of hostages, a common practice in Norse culture. From the Vanir, Njrr came to live among the Aesir, bringing his children Freyr and Freya with him. These 3 integrated into Asgardian society, bringing their gifts of prosperity and pleasure to balance the Aesir's focus on war and wisdom. From the Aesir, 2 figures went to the Vanir: Honor, described as handsome and large, and Mimir, Odin's uncle, known for his deep wisdom. This exchange should have sealed the peace permanently. But there was a problem. Honor looked impressive, but he couldn't make decisions on his own. Whenever the Vanir asked him important questions or sought his counsel, he would hesitate and say, "Let others decide," deferring to Mimir, who always stood beside him. The Vanir began to feel cheated. They had given valuable gods and received what seemed like a puppet and his handler in return. Their anger grew until they made a terrible decision. They took Mimir, this wise counselor, and they cut off his head. Then they sent the head back to Odin, a grim message about betrayal and insult. Odin, however, was not a god who wasted anything. He took Mimir's severed head, preserved it with herbs and magic, and spoke incantations over it until it could speak again. He placed the head at Mimir's well, Mimisbrunner, the well of wisdom beneath one of Yggdrasil's roots. There, Mimir's head remained, speaking prophecies and secrets to Odin whenever the Allfather came to consult it. Even in death or this strange undeath, Mimir served knowledge. Despite this horror, the peace held. The Aesir and Vanir learned to coexist, and eventually, the distinction between the 2 tribes blurred in practice, though it remained in memory. This integration brought something crucial: balance. The Aesir's warrior virtues combined with the Vanir's life-giving powers, fertility and death, creation and destruction, war and peace. The divine community became more complete. But consolidating divine power required more than ending wars. It required establishing order, creating systems that would persist. The gods began to formalize their governance. They held regular assemblies called things, councils where they debated, made laws, and settled disputes. This reflected human practice. The Norse themselves governed through things, meetings where free men could speak and vote. The most important divine assembly took place at Yggdrasil, the well of fate beneath Yggdrasil's root. Here, the gods came daily to hold court and make judgments. This wasn't arbitrary, the location mattered. At this well sat the three Norns, Ord, what has been, Verdandi, what is becoming, and Skuld, what shall be. These weren't gods exactly. They were something more fundamental, weavers or carvers of fate itself. Every day, the Norns drew water from the well and mixed it with the mud around the tree, then poured it over Yggdrasil's roots to keep the world tree healthy. They also carved or wove the fates of gods and humans alike into the tree's trunk. This is crucial to understanding Norse cosmology. Even the gods were subject to fate. They weren't all-powerful. They lived under the shadow of what the Norns had carved. The gods also established laws, though these were less written codes and more precedents and principles. Hospitality was sacred. Oaths were binding, sometimes magically so. Breaking a sworn word brought not just social shame but cosmic imbalance. Guest right, the protection owed to someone who had eaten at your table, was inviolable. One of the most important legal concepts was the wergild, the compensation paid for killing someone. This showed up in myths repeatedly. When the gods accidentally killed someone, they had to pay. When giants were wronged, they could demand payment. Even divine society operated on these principles of honor, debt, and obligation. Physical infrastructure grew around this divine order. Asgard expanded. Each major god built their own hall. Thor had Bilskirnir, a hall with 540 rooms. Freya had Sessrumnir in Folkvanger, where half of those who died in battle would come to her. Odin got the other half in Valhalla, his famous Hall of the Slain. These weren't just houses. They were expressions of divine identity and power. The gods also commissioned the dwarfs, master craftsmen who lived underground in caves and mountain halls, to create treasures. The dwarfs forged Mjolnir, Thor's hammer that always returned to his hand. They made Gungnir, Odin's spear that never missed its target. They crafted Draupnir, a golden ring that dripped 8 new rings of equal weight every 9th night. They built Skidbladnir, a ship that could hold all the gods but fold up small enough to fit in a pocket. These weren't just tools, they were symbols of divine authority, magical objects that reinforced the gods' power over the cosmos. Possession of them mattered. They could be stolen, lost, or won, and many myths revolve around these objects changing hands. Identity began to form around all this infrastructure and order. The Aesir defined themselves through their roles. Odin the knowledge seeker, Thor the giant slayer and protector, Tyr the upholder of law, Heimdall the watchman. But identity also formed through opposition. They were not giants, not the chaotic forces that threatened order. The giants remained outside, beyond the walls, representing everything wild and unpredictable. Yet the relationship between gods and giants was never simple. They fought constantly, yes, but they also intermarried. Many gods had giant mothers or giant lovers. The boundaries were permeable, which created both richness and danger. This wasn't a simple good versus evil conflict. It was family drama on a cosmic scale, with all the complications that entails. Religious practices among humans reflected this divine order. People sacrificed at temples or sacred groves. They swore oaths on rings. They held their own things modeled after the gods' assemblies. They told stories about the gods as examples of both what to do and what not to do, The myths were instructional but also cautionary to be why the end of this consolidation phase. A stable cosmos had emerged. Divine power shared and balanced between Aesir and Vanir, laws and assemblies providing structure, magical objects embodying authority. Clear roles and responsibilities for each god. A functional relationship between gods and humans. Established practices of sacrifice, oath-taking, and honor. Everything was in place for what seemed like it could last forever, a golden age of divine order and prosperity. But as we'll see, nothing in the Norse cosmos was meant to last forever. The seeds of destruction were already planted, woven into the very fabric of fate. There was a time, perhaps not long in cosmic terms but meaningful, when everything seemed to work. When the system the gods had built hummed along with a kind of magnificent energy. When Asgard gleamed under the sun that Sol drove across the sky. When the fields of Midgard grew green and abundant. When even the giants, though hostile, remained at a manageable distance. This was the flourishing, the golden age, though the Norse never quite called it that. They knew better than to assume permanence. Still, for a while, things were good. Imagine Asgard at its height. Not a city in the modern sense, but a collection of magnificent halls spread across a divine landscape. Each building reflected the character of its owner. Gladsheim, the Hall of Council, where the gods gathered to debate. Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain, where warriors who died bravely in battle spent their afterlife training for the final conflict. The roof was thatched with shields, the rafters made of spears, and every day the Einherjar. These chosen warriors would fight each other in the courtyard, dying and rising again, wounds healing, ready for the evening feast, because that's what they did every night. They feasted. Whole roasted boars, mead flowing like rivers, stories told and retold. The boar Saramnir was slaughtered and cooked each day by the cook Andrimnir in the cauldron Eldrimnir, and every morning it came back to life, ready to be eaten again. Infinite abundance. The mead came from the goat Ern, who stood on Valhalla's roof eating the leaves of Yggdrasil's tree Lurar, and from her udders flowed enough mead to fill a great vat that never emptied. This wasn't gluttony for its own sake. It was the Norse ideal of hospitality and plenty made eternal. The warrior's heaven wasn't peaceful rest. It was endless training and feasting, camaraderie and preparation. Even in paradise, they prepared for war. Thor, meanwhile, spent much of his time doing what he did best, killing giants. Not all giants, not indiscriminately, but those who threatened the order of things. He rode out in his chariot pulled by two goats, Tangrasnir and Tangjostr. Goats he could eat for dinner and resurrect in the morning by blessing their bones with his hammer. He crossed into Jotunheim, the giant realm, seeking challenges, defending boundaries, maintaining the separation between chaos and order. The stories of Thor's adventures became legendary. There was the time he went fishing with the giant Hymir and used an ox head as bait to catch Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircled Midgard. Thor nearly pulled the massive serpent up from the ocean depths, raising his hammer to strike, but Hymir, terrified, cut the line. The serpent sank back into the sea. This wasn't defeat exactly, but it was unfinished business, a confrontation delayed, not resolved. Or the time Thor visited the giant king Tgarloki and was challenged to various contests that seemed simple but were actually magical tricks. Thor tried to drain a drinking horn but couldn't, not knowing the other end was connected to the sea. He tried to lift a cat but could only raise one paw, not knowing it was actually Jormungandr in disguise. He wrestled an old woman and was brought to one knee, not knowing she was old age personified. Even when tricked, Thor's strength was so great that he nearly drained the ocean, nearly lifted the world serpent, nearly defeated time itself. These stories were more than entertainment. They showed the gods at their most powerful and active, maintaining the world through constant effort. The flourishing wasn't passive. It was fought for, maintained, renewed every day. Freyr and Freya brought different gifts. Freyr, with his magical ship and golden boar, ensured good harvests and peace. When he blessed the land, crops grew abundant. When he withdrew his favor, famine followed. Humans built shrines to him, made offerings at planting and harvest time. His was the prosperity that let communities survive winter, that let children grow strong, that made the hard life of farming just barely sustainable. Freya, his twin sister, was equally beloved but for different reasons. She was the goddess of love and beauty, yes, but also of a particular kind of magic called seer, women's magic, shamanic practices, the ability to see and shape fate itself. She wore the Brisingamen, a golden necklace of such beauty that she'd paid 4 dwarfs a night each to obtain it. She rode a chariot pulled by cats. Half of those who died in battle came to her hall, Sessrumner, where she received them as she chose. Freya represented power that didn't come from physical strength or weapons. Her power was desire, transformation, knowledge of hidden things. Men wanted her, gods desired her, giants schemed to possess her. She was the prize in multiple myths, the treasure that others tried to steal or win. But she was never passive in these stories. She negotiated, manipulated, and chose her own path. The cultural achievements of this period were remarkable. Poetry flourished, and poetry in the Norse world was sacred. The ability to compose verses wasn't just art. It was magic, a gift from Odin himself, who had stolen the mead of poetry from the giants. This mead was made from the blood of Kvasir, a being created from the peace treaty between Aesir and Vanir, a being of such wisdom that he could answer any question. Kvasir had been murdered by 2 dwarfs, Fjalar and Galar, who drained his blood, mixed it with honey, and created a mead that granted poetic inspiration and wisdom to whoever drank it. The dwarfs lost it to a giant, and eventually Odin, through a combination of seduction, shape-shifting, and theft, brought it to Asgard. Now the gods possessed it, and they shared drops with human poets, the skalds who would preserve the myths and histories in verse. The skalds themselves were honored figures in Norse society during this flourishing period. They traveled between halls, composing praise poems for kings and chieftains, preserving genealogies and great deeds in complex verse forms with intricate kennings. Metaphorical phrases like whale road for sea or battle sweat for blood. A good skald could ensure your fame lasted beyond death. A bad one or an enemy skald could destroy your reputation forever. Daily life in Midgard during this golden age wasn't easy by modern standards, but it was manageable. Communities lived in longhouses made of wood, turf, and stone. Extended families shared these spaces, humans and animals sometimes under the same roof, body heat combining against the cold. There was a rhythm to the year: spring planting, summer fishing and raiding, fall harvest, winter survival. But survival came with meaning. The gods watched over them. Sacrifices ensured divine favor. The community gathered for blots, ritual feasts where animals were sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on altars and people, their meat shared in communal meals. These weren't somber religious services but celebrations, binding the community together horizontally with each other and vertically with the divine powers. Trade expanded during this period. Norse ships, beautifully crafted with overlapping planks and dragonhead prows, could sail rivers and cross oceans. They reached Constantinople, Baghdad, North America. They brought back silver, silk, spices, ideas. The world grew larger even as local traditions remained strong. There were laws now, too, formalized at things, where disputes were settled through argument, compensation, or, when necessary, sanctioned combat. The law codes weren't written down everywhere, but they were known, memorized, recited. They covered everything from murder to grazing rights to inheritance. Honor and shame regulated behavior as much as formal punishment. Women in this society had more power than in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, divorce their husbands, inherit land. A woman who managed a household while her husband sailed away raiding held real authority. Freya and the Valkyries provided divine models of female power, not equal to male power exactly, but parallel, different, respected in its own right. The infrastructure supporting all this was magical and practical combined. Yggdrasil continued to stand at the center, its roots and branches connecting everything. The dwarfs in their underground forges created more wonders. The light elves in Alfheim wove beauty into the world. Even the dark elves or dwarfs contributed, though their creations sometimes came with hidden costs. The gods themselves seemed settled into their roles. Odin wandered, disguised, seeking ever more knowledge, sometimes at terrible cost. Thor protected, Freyr blessed, Tyr upheld law. Heimdall watched from Bifrost, his hearing so acute he could hear grass growing, his vision so sharp he could see for hundreds of miles. His horn, Gyllerhorn, waited for the moment it would need to be blown. A warning of the end, but that moment seemed far away. Even Loki, the trickster, the chaos bringer, seemed manageable during this time. Yes, he caused problems. He cut off Sif's golden hair and had to replace it. He tricked the gods into nearly losing Freya to a giant builder. He constantly stirred trouble, but his tricks were survivable, often even beneficial in unexpected ways. The gods tolerated him because he was useful, because he was Odin's blood brother, because even chaos has its place in a living system. This was the pinnacle, not perfect, never perfect in the Norse worldview, but functional, vital, alive. The gods were at their strongest. Humans prospered under their protection. The giants remained at bay. The system worked. But embedded in all this success were the seeds of its own destruction. The price Odin paid for wisdom, the prophecies the Norns carved, the enemies the gods made, the compromises they accepted, the lies they told themselves about permanence. Still, for now, the sun rose and set. The seasons turned. The mead flowed. The Einherjar trained. The harvests came. And if you listened very carefully, beneath all the noise and celebration, you might have heard the faint scraping of the Norns' stylus against Yggdrasil's trunk, carving what was to come. Let's pull back from the grand myths for a moment and look at how things actually worked. The mechanics beneath the magic, the daily operations that kept the nine worlds turning. Because the Norse cosmos wasn't maintained by abstract divine will alone. It required effort, ritual, relationship, and constant negotiation between forces that never quite balanced perfectly. Start with Yggdrasil itself, the world tree. This wasn't a static symbol. It was a living system that needed maintenance. Every day, the three Norns climbed down from their well and tended to it. They drew water mixed with the white mud from Yggdrasil and poured it over the roots, keeping the massive ash tree from rotting, from drying out, from dying. This wasn't ceremonial, it was necessary. Without their daily work, the tree would sicken, and if the tree sickened, the entire structure of reality would collapse. But even with the Norns' care, Yggdrasil suffered constant assault. A great serpent called Nhggr gnawed at its roots from below, in the realm of the dead, trying to tear through to the other side. In the branches above, for stags, Dane, Dvalin, Dunir, and Durar, ate the leaves and buds, consuming faster than the tree could grow. And running up and down the trunk, a squirrel named Ratatoskr carried insults between Nhggr at the roots and an eagle perched at the very top of the tree. Think about that for a moment. The axis of the universe, the thing holding all nine worlds together, was under constant attack from animals. Not gods or giants, a serpent, some deer, and a squirrel with a talent for gossip. The Norse cosmos was magnificent but also slightly absurd, undermined by petty conflicts and hungry creatures. Order required eternal vigilance against forces both grand and trivial. The gods' daily assembly at Yggdrasil wasn't just political theater. It was how they governed, how they made decisions that affected all the realms. Every morning they rowed across Bifrost, except for Thor, who was too heavy and might break the Rainbow Bridge, so he waded through rivers instead. They gathered at the well, discussed problems, made judgments, settled disputes. These weren't autocratic pronouncements from Odin. The Norse gods operated more like a council of powerful individuals who had to negotiate with each other. Odin had authority, yes, but he couldn't simply command the other gods to obey. He had to persuade, manipulate, or occasionally trick them. Thor had his own power base among those who valued strength and protection. Freyr and Freya brought the Vanir perspective. Tyr represented law and justice. Each god had domains, priorities, and the ability to resist if pushed too far. This mirrored human society. Norse chieftains and kings ruled by consent as much as force. A king who lost the support of powerful families would find himself challenged or replaced. Authority came from reputation, gift-giving, successful warfare, and the ability to maintain order. The gods operated the same way. They had to earn continued respect. Sacrifice was the mechanism that connected divine and human realms. Not sacrifice in the abstract sense, but specific, practical exchanges. Humans gave the gods valuable things. Animals, food, drink, sometimes treasures, occasionally lives, and expected tangible returns. Not vague spiritual blessings, but good harvests, victory in battle, safe voyages, healthy children. The blot, the sacrificial feast, had a structure. First, the animal, a horse, cow, pig, or goat, was killed in a ritual manner. Its blood was collected in a bowl called a hlot bali, then sprinkled on the altar, the walls, and the assembled people using twigs called hlotiner. This blood was sacred, connecting the participants to the divine. Then the meat was cooked and shared in a communal meal. The gods received the blood and the burnt offerings. The humans ate the meat. Both sides benefited. Oaths operated on similar principles of binding exchange. When someone swore an oath, they often did it on a ring, sometimes a ring reddened with sacrificial blood. Breaking such an oath wasn't just socially shameful, it was cosmically dangerous. The oathbreaker became Ningur, a term of ultimate contempt meaning someone so dishonorable they'd broken the fundamental bonds of trust that held society together. A Ningur could be killed without legal consequence. The gods themselves were bound by oaths. When Odin swore blood brotherhood with Loki, mixing their blood, that oath couldn't be undone. When the gods swore to pay a giant builder for constructing Asgard's wall, they were bound to keep that promise, or find a loophole, which they did with Loki's help. Oaths created webs of obligation that structured relationships across all levels of the cosmos. The economic system that supported this world operated on gift exchange and reputation rather than market capitalism. A chieftain demonstrated his power and generosity by giving gifts to his followers: weapons, rings, land, feast invitations. The recipients gained material benefit but also honor and obligation. They were expected to reciprocate with loyalty, service, and their own gifts when able. Stinginess was shameful. Generosity built power. The gods did this too. Odin gave gifts to his favorite warriors and poets. Freyr blessed those who honored him with abundant crops. Thor protected those who called on him. The divine-human relationship was transactional but not cold. It was personal, built on repeated exchanges that created lasting bonds. Professional specialists maintained various aspects of the system. The Gwa in Icelandic society served as both chieftain and priest, performing sacrifices and presiding over local things. The Volva, a female seer who practiced seer magic, traveled between communities providing prophecy and magical services. The Skalds preserved history and composed praise that could make or break reputations. The law speakers memorized and recited the law codes at assemblies. Each role was essential. Without the Gwa, sacrifices wouldn't be performed correctly. Without the Volva, Communities couldn't access hidden knowledge about crops, weather, or enemies. Without the skalds, deeds would be forgotten and fame would die with the body. Without the law speakers, legal precedents would be lost and disputes would escalate to endless feuds. The calendar itself was sacred technology. The year divided into seasons marked by festivals, winter nights, Yule, summer's arrival. These weren't arbitrary holidays but crucial moments when the boundary between worlds thinned, when sacrifices were most effective, when oaths gained extra power. Time wasn't neutral. Certain times were charged with significance, dangerous or auspicious depending on what you needed to accomplish. Magic, or at least certain kinds of magic, was woven into daily practice. Runes weren't just an alphabet, they were tools of power. Each rune had meaning beyond its sound. Fehu meant wealth/cattle. Thurisaz meant giant/thorn. And Suz meant god/breath. Carving runes in specific combinations on weapons, tools, or stones could bring luck, protection, or harm. This wasn't superstition to the Norse, it was technology, as practical as a hammer or plow. Divination practices let people glimpse what the Norns had carved. Casting rune stones, reading the flight of birds, interpreting dreams, consulting a Volva who entered a trance state. These were ways to navigate uncertainty. You couldn't change fate, the Norse believed, but you could prepare for it. Position yourself to face it with courage rather than be blindsided. The law codes covered remarkably specific situations. If your cow trampled someone's field, you owed compensation. If someone insulted you in certain ways, you had grounds for legal action or even justifiable revenge. If two families got into a feud, there were procedures for mediation and wergild payments to settle it without endless bloodshed. The law aimed not for perfect justice but for social stability, ending conflicts before they destroyed communities. Women's roles in this system were complex. While men dominated public assemblies and warfare, women controlled household economies and played crucial religious roles. A wife managed the keys to all storage and distributed resources. A Volva commanded respect and fear. A woman could divorce a husband who failed to provide or who dishonored her. The sources are frustratingly incomplete, but it's clear women weren't simply powerless. They operated within different spheres with different kinds of authority. The relationship between humans and the land was also ritualized. Fields were blessed. Boundaries were marked with sacred stones or posts. Certain groves, springs, or mountains were holy, places where the divine was particularly present. You didn't own land in the modern sense. You held it, used it, passed it down, but always with awareness that it was part of a larger sacred geography. Death, too, was structured and meaningful. The manner of your death determined your afterlife. Die in battle, and you might go to Valhalla or Freya's Folkvanger. Die of old age or sickness, and you went to hell, not a place of punishment but simply the realm of the dead, gray and cold but not torturous. Die at sea, and you might go to Rance Hall beneath the waves. Your reputation, what people said about you after death, mattered more than where you ended up. Burial practices reflected this. Important people were buried in ships or with their weapons, tools, animals, even slaves killed to accompany them. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was provision for the journey. The dead needed what they had in life. The living needed to send them properly, to maintain the honor of the family, to ensure the dead didn't become draugr, dangerous revenants who haunted the living. All these systems, religious, legal, economic, magical, interlocked and reinforced each other. Honor was maintained through gift-giving, validated in assemblies, defended in feuds, preserved in skaldic verse, blessed by sacrifices, and would outlast death. The gods watched over it all, both participants and guarantors. When humans upheld their end, sacrificing, oath-keeping, living honorably, the gods reciprocated. When they failed, disaster followed. This wasn't a cosmos of arbitrary divine whim. It was structured, reciprocal, demanding. It required work from everyone, gods, humans, even the Norns tending the tree. Nothing was automatic. Order was maintained against constant pressure from chaos, decay, and the simple passage of time. And everyone knew, on some level, that even all this effort wouldn't be enough forever. There was a moment, perhaps not a single day or year, but a feeling that permeated the cosmos, when everything the gods had built seemed unshakable, when Asgard's walls stood tallest, when the Einherjar numbered in the thousands, training daily for a war they were certain they'd win, when sacrifices flowed abundantly from Midgard, strengthening the bonds between gods and humans, when even the giants, though eternally hostile, seemed contained, manageable, a problem to be dealt with rather than an existential threat. This was the pinnacle, the moment when the Norse cosmos felt most permanent, most secure, most like it could actually last forever despite all the prophecies whispering otherwise. Valhalla had never been fuller. Every day, the Valkyries rode out across Midgard, watching battles from above on their flying horses. These weren't angels, they were choosers of the slain, warrior women who picked which fallen heroes would join Odin's army. A man might see them hovering above the battlefield, beautiful and terrible, and know his death was coming. But if he was chosen, if a Valkyrie pointed at him, that death became glorious rather than merely final. The selected warriors arrived in Valhalla to find everything they'd been promised. Endless combat without permanent death, unlimited food and drink, camaraderie with the greatest fighters in history, and the presence of Odin himself, the All-Father, who walked among them, listened to their stories, learned from their experiences. This was the warrior's paradise fully realized. Not passive rest, but active preparation. Every day bringing them closer to readiness for Ragnarok. That final battle they'd been recruited to fight. The number mattered. Odin needed an army large enough to face the forces that would eventually come against Asgard. So the Valkyries were selective but not too selective. Every great warrior who died with a weapon in hand was a potential recruit. The mead hall echoed with dozens of languages, hundreds of cultures, all united in this single purpose: to train, to feast, to be ready. Thor, meanwhile, had reached the height of his power and reputation. His hammer Mjolnir had become legendary, not just among gods but among humans who wore small hammer amulets for protection. When Thor rode out in his chariot, thunder rolling across the sky, giants trembled. When he blessed a marriage or a new hall, prosperity followed. When he consecrated a funeral pyre, the dead were honored properly. His encounters with giants had become almost routine. He'd killed so many that they'd learned to fear him, to hide when they heard his chariot approaching, to scheme in secret rather than challenge him openly. The story of his fishing for Jormungandr had spread, how he'd nearly pulled the world serpent from the ocean, how he'd raised Mjolnir to strike before being stopped. It was unfinished business, yes, but also proof of his strength. If he could nearly best the Midgard serpent in a casual fishing trip, what couldn't he do at full power? Freyr had blessed the land so thoroughly that even poor soil produced harvests. His boar, Gullinbursti, with bristles of real gold that glowed in the dark, was a symbol of prosperity visible from great distances. His ship's Glenir could carry all the gods yet fold up to fit in a pouch, a miracle of dwarfcraft that represented Norse ingenuity at its finest. Peace and plenty followed wherever Freyr turned his attention. Freya, for her part, had become the most desired being in all the 9 worlds. Her beauty was unmatched. Her necklace Brisingamen sparkled like captured starlight, and her knowledge of seer magic made her both powerful and slightly dangerous. Giants constantly schemed to possess her, not just from lust, though that played a role, but because she represented the ultimate prize, the goddess whose favor could change everything. That she remained in Asgard, choosing her own lovers on her own terms, was a sign of the god's strength. The infrastructure had reached its peak efficiency. Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, connected Asgard to Midgard seamlessly. Heimdall stood eternal watch at its base, his hearing so acute he could detect a threat before it formed into action. His eyesight so sharp he could see across all 9 worlds. His horn Gyllerhorn hung ready but unused. No emergency had yet required its warning blast. That the horn stayed silent was itself a sign of success. The dwarfs in their underground halls produced wonders at an unprecedented rate. New magical objects emerged regularly. Rings that multiplied wealth, spears that never missed, shields that couldn't be broken, ships that sailed themselves. The gods commissioned these items and paid well, usually in gold, sometimes in other favors, and the dwarfs, master craftsmen that they were, took pride in each creation. The relationship was mutually beneficial, a functional economy spanning the realms. Human society reflected this divine pinnacle. Norse expansion had reached its greatest extent. Ships sailed from Scandinavia to Constantinople, Baghdad, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and even the coast of North America. Wherever they went, they brought their gods with them, established new temples, performed new sacrifices, spread the old stories to new lands. The mythology wasn't static. It absorbed new elements, adapted to new environments, but kept its core intact. Kings and chieftains competed to outdo each other in generosity and glory. The great halls grew larger, the feasts more elaborate, the gift-giving more extravagant. A successful leader might give his warriors armorings of silver or gold, fine weapons, shares of plunder. In return, he received loyalty that made him nearly invincible. This cycle, generosity producing loyalty, producing success, producing more generosity, seemed perpetual. The law codes had been refined through generations of precedent. Nearly every possible dispute had been adjudicated at something or another, creating a body of case law that covered everything from property damage to murder to inheritance disputes. Legal specialists could recite these precedents from memory, apply them to new situations, and generally maintain order without requiring constant divine intervention. Poetry reached its highest artistry. The most skilled skalds could compose verses of such complexity and beauty that listeners wept. The kennings became more elaborate. The sea wasn't just whale road, but raven's drink hall or ship's swan path. Battle wasn't just swordplay, but wound fire or shield storm. Every image layered meaning upon meaning, creating verses that rewarded deep contemplation and multiple hearings. The skalds served a crucial function beyond entertainment. They were living memory, walking history books who preserved genealogies, great deeds, and cautionary tales in verse form. A wise king kept a good skald close, not just for praise poems, but for the cultural continuity they provided. When the skald recited the deeds of ancestors, he connected the present to the past, gave legitimacy to current rulers, and inspired future generations. Even Loki seemed at his most useful during this period. Yes, he still caused problems, he couldn't help himself, but his tricks tended to work out in the gods' favor. When he cut off Sif's golden hair, he replaced it with even more beautiful hair made by dwarfs. When he nearly cost them Freya in the giant builder incident, his solution, transforming into a mare to distract the builder's horse, actually worked. His chaos generated solutions as often as problems. The relationship between gods and giants, while never friendly, had settled into a kind of Cold War stability. The giants stayed mostly in Jotunheim. The gods stayed mostly in Asgard. When they interacted, it was usually through trickery, theft, or occasional marriages rather than open warfare. Both sides knew where the boundaries were and mostly respected them, if grudgingly. The sense of permanence was almost tangible. When humans looked at the world around them, the mountains that seemed eternal, the sea that had always been there, the sky that had never fallen, they saw the same stability in the divine realm. The gods had been there for as long as anyone could remember. They'd survived the war with the Vanir, built their infrastructure, established their systems. Why would that ever change? The prophecies were known, of course. The Volvas spoke of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle where everything would end. But those prophecies seemed distant, abstract, something for the far future to worry about. In the meantime, there was mead to drink, battles to fight, harvests to bring in, children to raise, stories to tell. The present felt solid. The system worked. Odin sat on Hliskjolf, his high seat, and looked out across all 9 worlds. He saw the Einherjar training in Valhalla's courtyard. He saw Thor riding out to challenge giants. He saw Freyr blessing the fields. He saw Heimdall watching at Bifrost. He saw the humans in Midgard performing their sacrifices, keeping their oaths, living according to the values the gods had modeled. Everything was as it should be. But Odin, more than any other god, knew about costs. He'd sacrificed his eye for wisdom. He'd hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn the runes. He'd consulted Mimir's severed head, listened to the Volva's prophecies, pursued knowledge at prices that would make others flinch. And all that knowledge whispered the same truth: nothing lasts forever. Every golden age contains the seeds of its own destruction. The higher you build, the farther you have to fall. Still, for now, for this moment at the pinnacle, the sun shone bright over Asgard. The world tree stood strong. The cosmos hummed with life and meaning. If you were there, looking up at those golden halls, hearing the thunder of Thor's chariot, smelling the smoke from sacrificial fires, feeling the presence of powers greater than yourself, you might have believed it really could last forever. You would have been wrong. But the belief, while it lasted, was magnificent. The first crack didn't announce itself with thunder or catastrophe. It came quietly, in the form of dreams. Baldur, the most beloved of all the gods, began to dream of his own death. Night after night, he woke in his hall, shaken by visions he couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore. Baldur was everything good in the Norse pantheon: beautiful, wise, gentle, loved by everyone who knew him. His very presence brought light and joy. The idea that something could harm him seemed impossible, like imagining the sun simply failing to rise one morning. But dreams in the Norse world weren't random neurological noise. They were messages, warnings, glimpses of what the Norns had already carved into Yggdrasil's trunk. Baldur's dreams weren't anxiety, they were prophecy. And everyone who heard about them felt the first cold touch of fear. Frigg, Baldur's mother and Odin's wife, couldn't bear the thought of losing her son. She decided to act, to do something unprecedented. She would make all of creation promise not to harm Baldur. She traveled through all 9 worlds, extracting oaths from everything that existed. Fire promised not to burn him. Water promised not to drown him. Stones promised not to strike him. Metals promised not to cut him. Animals, plants, diseases, everything swore not to hurt Baldur. Almost everything. There was one plant Frigg overlooked, or perhaps dismissed as too insignificant to bother with: mistletoe. It was young, small, growing west of Valhalla, seeming harmless. She didn't think it worth the effort to exact an oath from it. This was the first mistake. Not a dramatic one, not obviously foolish, just a small oversight. The kind anyone might make. When Frigg returned and announced that Baldur was now invulnerable, the gods celebrated by inventing a new game. They would throw things at Baldur: stones, spears, axes, and watch them bounce off harmlessly or veer away at the last moment. It became entertainment, a demonstration of divine power over fate itself. Baldur stood in the center while the gods laughed and tested his invulnerability with increasingly dangerous objects. He never flinched. Nothing could hurt him. Except Loki, watching from the edges of this celebration, felt something twist inside him. Jealousy, perhaps, or that deep trickster impulse that can't leave well enough alone. that has to probe every system for its weakness, that finds satisfaction in revealing that nothing is as secure as it seems. He disguised himself as an old woman and went to Frigg. In conversation, he gently, cleverly extracted the truth. Yes, she'd gotten oaths from everything. Well, almost everything. There was this one little plant, mistletoe, but surely that couldn't matter. Loki went to where the mistletoe grew. He cut a branch, shaped it carefully, and returned to the gathering where the gods were still throwing things at Balder. He found HR, Balder's blind brother, standing apart from the festivities. HR wanted to honor Balder too, but being blind, he couldn't participate in the game. "Let me help you," Loki said, his voice friendly, helpful. He placed the mistletoe shaft in HR's hand, guided his aim, and told him to throw. HR threw. The mistletoe struck Balder in the chest and pierced him through. Balder fell, and the sound of his body hitting the ground was the sound of something fundamental breaking. The invulnerable god was dead. The most beloved was gone. And it had happened not through great malice or overwhelming force, but through a small oversight and a moment of manipulation. The silence that followed must have been absolute. Then came grief so profound it shook the cosmos. Frigg wept. Odin, who saw farther than most gods, understood immediately that this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the beginning of the end. The Norns' carvings were coming to pass. Ragnarok had moved from distant prophecy to approaching reality. The gods decided to try to undo it. They sent Hermr, another of Odin's sons, to Hel, the realm of the dead, to bargain for Balder's return. Hermr rode Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir for 9 nights through dark valleys until he reached the gates of Hel's realm. He found Balder there, sitting in a place of honor but clearly dead, clearly gone from the world of the living. Hel, the goddess who ruled this realm, half alive and half corpse, daughter of Loki, listened to Hermr's plea. She agreed to release Balder on one condition. Everything in the cosmos had to weep for him. If all things mourned Balder, he could return. But if even one being refused to weep, he would remain in her realm forever. The gods sent messengers everywhere, and everything wept. Men, women, animals, stones, trees, metals. Even the earth itself seemed to weep with dew and rain. It seemed the condition would be met. Balder would return. The crack could be repaired. But in a cave somewhere, the messengers found a giantess named KK. When they asked her to weep for Balder, she refused. "Let Hel keep what she has," she said coldly. And so Balder remained dead. Most sources suggest that KK was actually Loki in disguise, adding one final insult to his crime. He'd killed Balder through HR's innocent hand, and now he prevented Balder's return by refusing to mourn. This was the moment Loki crossed from useful trickster to active enemy of the gods. The Aesir's response was swift and terrible. They hunted Loki down. He tried to hide, transforming into a salmon and hiding in a waterfall, but the gods caught him. They took him to a cave and bound him with chains made from the entrails of his own son, Narfi, whom they'd killed for this purpose. They placed a venomous serpent above Loki's head, positioned so its poison would drip onto his face for eternity. Sigyn, Loki's wife, stayed with him, holding a bowl to catch the poison drops. But when the bowl filled and she had to turn away to empty it, the venom fell on Loki's face, and his thrashing in agony caused earthquakes in Midgard. There he would remain, bound and tormented until Ragnarok, at which point he would break free and lead the giants against the gods. The death of Balder changed everything. The gods had believed they could protect what they loved, that they could make promises bind reality itself. They were wrong. A small oversight, a moment of trickery, and their most beloved was gone permanently. The game where they'd thrown weapons at him, that joyful display of his invulnerability, now seemed horrifically naive, almost mocking in retrospect. But there were other cracks appearing too, less dramatic but equally telling. The giants were growing bolder. With Loki imprisoned and Balder dead, the balance of power had shifted slightly. Giant raids on the edges of Midgard increased. More humans died without making it to Valhalla, killed in ways that didn't count as battle deaths, dying of disease or accidents or old age, swelling the population of Hel rather than Odin's army. The Einherjar still trained in Valhalla, but their numbers weren't growing as fast as they once had. And some of the warriors who arrived weren't quite as skilled as previous generations. The quality of warfare was changing. It was becoming less about individual heroism and more about tactics, numbers, coordination, things that didn't necessarily earn you a place among the chosen slain. Odin felt this more than anyone. His pursuit of knowledge had always been desperate, driven by the understanding that the gods weren't all-powerful, that Ragnarok was coming. But after Baldur's death, that desperation intensified. He consulted Mimir's head more frequently. He visited Valvas and demanded prophecies. He sent his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, farther and more often, gathering information from across all 9 worlds. What he learned didn't comfort him. The giants were organizing. Old grudges were being remembered. Alliances were forming in Jotunheim, uniting frost giants and fire giants and mountain giants in ways they'd never unified before. The killing of Ymir at the beginning of time, the constant harassment from Thor, the theft of their women and treasures, all of it was being tallied, and the bill would eventually come due. Even the natural world seemed less stable. Winters grew harsher in Midgard, summers shorter. Crops failed more often despite Freyr's blessings. The sacrifices that had once guaranteed prosperity now only ensured survival. Something in the cosmic bargain was breaking down. The reciprocal relationship between gods and humans losing its efficiency that in Asgard itself. Tensions that had been manageable before now festered. Without Loki to blame for every problem, the gods had to confront their own flaws and conflicts. Old arguments resurfaced. The integration of the Vanir, which had seemed complete, showed strain. There were theological differences, different priorities, different understandings of what the gods should be doing. Thor continued his giant killing, but even he noticed they were harder to kill now, better armed, more organized. The casual fishing trip to catch Jormungandr seemed like a relic of easier times. Now when Thor rode out, he went prepared for real war, not just sport. The world tree itself showed signs of stress. Despite the Norns' daily care, Yggdrasil's leaves yellowed in places. NHGGR's gnawing seemed more effective, cutting deeper. The stags ate more voraciously. Even Ratatoskr's insults carried a sharper edge, as if the squirrel sensed something coming and wanted to accelerate it. These were the first cracks, not catastrophic failures yet, but clear signs that the golden age had passed. The pinnacle was behind them now. Ahead lay uncertainty, decline, and the slow realization that all their preparations might not be enough to end the halls of Asgard. The mead still flowed and the Einherjar still trained. But the laughter was quieter now. The confidence was gone. They'd learned that even gods could be killed by something as small and insignificant as mistletoe, if wielded at the right moment in the right way. And if Balder could die, if the most innocent and beloved could be destroyed through a simple trick, then what hope did any of them have when the real war finally came? The signs came faster now, each one confirming what Odin had always known but hoped might somehow be avoided. The Valvas had prophesied it, the Norns had carved it, and now reality itself began to bend toward that terrible convergence called Ragnarok. The doom of the gods, the twilight of the powers. First came the Fimbulvetr, the great winter. Not a normal winter, not even a harsh one, but 3 winters in succession with no summer between them. Snow fell and never melted. Ice spread from the north like a living thing, reclaiming land that humans had worked for generations. The sun seemed weaker, its light thin and cold, as if Sol's strength was finally failing after all those years of being chased by Skoll the wolf that in Midgard, humans starved. The harvests that Freyr had once blessed so reliably simply didn't come. The soil froze solid. Animals died. Food stores ran out. And when people are desperate and cold and watching their children die, something happens to the bonds that hold society together. Those bonds fray. They snap. Brother turned against brother over scraps of food. Sons killed fathers for inheritance they couldn't wait to receive. The law codes that had maintained order became irrelevant when survival was the only law that mattered. The things, those sacred assemblies where disputes were settled peacefully, stopped being called. Why debate property rights when property itself had become meaningless? The oaths that had held communities together, those sacred promises sworn on rings reddened with blood, were broken casually, without remorse. When oath-breaking becomes common, when Ningur ceases to be an insult because everyone is dishonored, then the cosmic order itself begins to collapse. The gods had built their system on reciprocal obligation, on the sanctity of promises. When humans stopped keeping their word, they stopped being fully human in the Norse sense. Sacrifices stopped flowing from Midgard to Asgard, not because people chose to withhold them, but because they had nothing left to sacrifice. No animals remained to slaughter. No mead remained to pour. The connection between divine and human realms, maintained for centuries through ritual exchange, simply dried up. The gods found themselves alone, cut off, weakened by the lack of that vital energy that sacrifice provided. In Asgard, the gods watched all this and knew what it meant. The Fimbulvetr wasn't just bad weather, it was a countdown. When the great winter ended, Ragnarok would begin, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Thor rode out more desperately now, trying to hold back the tide of chaos. He killed giants by the dozen, but for every one he struck down, 2 more emerged from Jotunheim. The giant population had been growing, multiplying, preparing. Every frost giant could trace their lineage back to Bergelmir, who had survived the flood of Ymir's blood. They remembered. They'd been planning their revenge for ages. Freyr found his powers diminishing. Without the faith and sacrifice of humans, without the orderly turning of seasons, his ability to bless and prosper faded. His golden boar still glowed, his ship still sailed, but the magic felt hollow now, performative rather than effectual. He'd once been able to make crops grow in poor soil. Now even good soil lay frozen and dead. Freya withdrew into her hall. Half of the battle dead had come to her in better times, but now the dead came only to hell, to that gray realm where they sat in dim silence, neither punished nor rewarded, simply existing in the aftermath of life. Sessrumnir, once filled with chosen warriors and feast hall joy, echoed with emptiness. Heimdall stood at his post on Bifrost, watching with those impossibly acute senses, and what he saw in every direction was dissolution. The rainbow bridge itself looked faded now, its colors less vivid, as if the connection between worlds was weakening. He'd been placed there to watch for the approach of enemies, but the enemies weren't coming from outside anymore. They were emerging from within, from the cracks that had spread through the entire structure of reality. Odin grew frantic in his knowledge-seeking. He consulted Mimir's severed head daily, asking the same questions, hoping for different answers. He sent Hugin and Munin out so often that sometimes only one returned, and he feared the day when neither would come back, when he would lose both thought and memory and face the end blind to what was coming. He visited Avalva one last time, compelling her to rise from death to prophesy. The Voluspa, the prophecy of the seer, laid out everything that was coming with terrible clarity. She spoke of wolves devouring the sun and moon, of stars falling from the sky, of the earth shaking and mountains crumbling, of Loki breaking free from his bonds, of the great ship Naglfar, built from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, sailing forth from Niflheim with an army of the dishonored dead. She spoke of Heimdall finally blowing Gyllerhorn, that great horn whose blast would wake all the 9 worlds and summon the gods to their final battle. She spoke of Yggdrasil trembling, the world tree shaking from root to crown. She spoke of the fire giant Surtur marching north from Muspelheim with his flaming sword, ready to burn everything the gods had built. And she spoke of the great battlefield called Yggdrasil, where all the forces would meet. Gods and giants, Einherjar and the armies of the dead, order against chaos in a final, apocalyptic confrontation. She told Odin exactly how he would die, how Thor would die, how each god would meet their fate. And then she sank back into death, her prophecy complete, leaving Odin with knowledge that was simultaneously priceless and utterly useless. Because knowing doesn't mean you can change it. That was the cruel heart of Norse fate. The Norns carved what would be, and not even gods could alter those carvings. You could see your doom approaching and still have to walk toward it. The Einherjar in Valhalla continued training, but the certainty had gone out of their practice. They'd been told they were preparing to win a great battle. Now it became clear they were preparing to die in one. Still they trained, because what else could they do? At least they would die as warriors, weapons in hand, fighting for something that mattered even if it was doomed. Loki, bound in his cave, felt the weakening of the cosmic order. The chains made from his son's entrails began to loosen, not because anyone freed him, but because oaths and bonds were losing their power everywhere. When the Fimbulvetr ended, he would break free completely. And when he broke free, he would call his children to join the final battle. His children were monsters, born from his union with the giantess Angerboa. Fenrir, the great wolf, who had been bound by the gods with the magical ribbon Gleipnir after he grew too dangerous. Jormungandr, the world serpent, who encircled Midgard in the ocean depths. And Hel, the goddess of death, ruling her gray realm. All three would rise for Ragnarok, each with a role to play in destroying what their father's adopted family had built. The social fabric of Midgard continued its disintegration. Warriors who had once fought honorably now ambushed and murdered. Women were taken as spoils. Children were abandoned. The values that had given Norse society its structure, honor, loyalty, hospitality, oath-keeping, became historical curiosities, things remembered from better times but no longer practiced. Some humans tried to maintain the old ways. They gathered in small communities, shared what little they had, kept telling the old stories around failing fires. But they were exceptions, islands of order in a sea of chaos. And even they knew it was temporary. The winter would eventually take them too. The law speakers stopped reciting the law codes because no one listened anymore. The skalds stopped composing because no kings remained to patron them, and no halls remained where verse would be appreciated. The Volvas stopped prophesying because no one wanted to pay for knowledge of a future that held only death and destruction. In the frozen landscapes, wolves multiplied. Real wolves, not magical ones, but animals grown bold in the absence of human resistance. They hunted in packs, taking down livestock and sometimes people. The Norse had always respected wolves, seen them as symbols of wild power, but now wolves represented the return of chaos, the dissolution of the boundary between civilization and wilderness. And still the winter continued. 3 years without summer. 3 years of darkness, cold, and desperation. 3 years watching everything built and maintained over centuries simply fall apart. Not through dramatic destruction, but through cold, hunger, and the failure of humans to remain human when circumstances stripped away everything but survival instinct. Yggdrasil trembled more frequently now. The gods could feel it in Asgard, a deep vibration that came up through the ground. NHGGR had gnawed through most of one root. The stags had eaten so many leaves and branches that the tree's canopy looked skeletal. Even the Norns' daily care couldn't keep pace with the decay. The tree was dying, and when it died completely, the structure it supported would collapse. The gods held one final council at Yggdrasil. They stood around the well where they'd met daily for ages. where they'd made laws and settled disputes and tried to govern 9 worlds. Now they met to acknowledge what they'd always known. They were going to lose. Ragnarok would destroy them. The best they could do was die well, fighting hard, taking as many enemies with them as possible. Odin addressed them, his one-eye scanning faces he'd known for eons. Thor, his son, ready to face Jormungandr one last time. Tyr, who had sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir and would face the great wolf again. Freyr, who had given away his sword long ago in exchange for the giantess Gareth's love and would fight weaponless. Heimdall, who would blow the horn and then fight Loki to their mutual destruction. They made no speeches about victory. They didn't promise to prevail. They simply agreed to stand together when the time came, to fight as they'd always fought, to die as gods should die, with weapons in hand, facing their enemies, defiant to the last breath. The Fimbulvetr entered its final months. The ice reached its maximum extent. The cold settled into a steady, crushing presence. And then, finally, the signs they'd been dreading began to appear. The wolf's skull and Hati closed in on the sun and moon, ready to devour them. The earth started to shake with increasing violence. In the ocean, Jormungandr stirred, beginning to uncoil from around Midgard. Loki's chains snapped. He rose from his cave, face scarred by millennia of venom, and called his children and allies to join him. In Niflheim, the ship Naglfar prepared to sail. In Muspelheim, Surtur gripped his flaming sword and began his march north. Heimdall reached for Gjallarhorn. The moment had come. The unraveling was complete. Now came the breaking. The sound of Gjallarhorn was not musical. It was a scream in the shape of sound, a blast so powerful it tore through all 9 worlds simultaneously, waking everything that could wake and warning everything that could hear. Heimdall, standing at his eternal post on Bifrost, put the horn to his lips and blew with all the force of a god who knew this would be the last sound he would ever make with Yggdrasil in Valhalla. The Einherjar rose from their benches, thousands of warriors who had been training for this moment across centuries. They grabbed their weapons, swords that never dulled, shields that had been tested in 10,000 practice battles, spears blessed by Odin himself. They formed ranks not with fear but with grim purpose. This was what they'd been chosen for. This was the meaning of all those years of combat and feasting. Odin emerged from his hall in full war gear, Gungnir in hand, his golden helmet catching what little light remained in the dying sky. He mounted Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, fastest of all steeds, and rode to the front of the Einherjar host. Behind him came Thor in his chariot pulled by Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, Mjolnir at his side, thunder rolling from the wheels. Tyr, one-handed but undaunted. Freyr, weaponless but resolved. Every god who could fight prepared to march to VGRR, the battlefield at the end of the world. From the other direction came the forces of chaos. Loki broke free completely from his bonds and sailed forth on Naglfar, that grotesque ship built from the fingernails and toenails of the unburied dead. With him came an army of dishonored dead from Hell's realm, those who died of sickness, old age, cowardice, all the inglorious deaths that hadn't earned them Valhalla or Folkvanger. They were countless, a gray mass of the forgotten and the failed, given one last chance to matter in the final battle. From Jotunheim came the Frost Giants, led by Hrwam, marching in organized columns, carrying weapons they'd been forging and stockpiling for generations. Every giant who had lost family to Thor's hammer, every giant who remembered the murder of Ymir, every giant who had been driven back from the edges of Midgard, they all marched together now, united by rage and the promise of revenge. From the deep ocean, Jormungandr rose. The Midgard serpent uncoiled itself from around the world, and as it did, massive waves crashed across coastlines, flooding what remained of human settlements, drowning the last survivors of the Fimbulvetr. The serpent's body was so vast that its movement shifted continents. Its venom dripped from fangs the size of mountains, poisoning the sea, turning the water black and toxic. From the south came Surtur and the fire giants of Muspelheim. Surtur's sword blazed brighter than the sun had ever been, hot enough to melt stone, trailing flames that ignited the air itself. As the fire giants marched north, they left nothing but scorched earth and molten rock behind them. They were coming to burn the world, to return everything to the primal fire from which it had been temporarily rescued at the beginning of time. And from beneath the earth came Fenrir, the great wolf, breaking free from Gleipnir at last. His jaws could span from earth to sky. His howl was the sound of ending itself. He ran toward the battlefield with hunger in his eyes, eager to devour Odin as the prophecies had promised, eager to consume the All-Father who had ordered him bound so long ago. The sun was swallowed by Skoll. Darkness crashed across the sky like a curtain falling. A moment later, Hati caught the moon. All celestial light vanished. The stars fell like burning rain, and in the absolute darkness, the armies met at Vigrar. The battle began without formal challenge or declaration. It simply erupted, order against chaos, gods against giants, the chosen dead against the dishonored dead. Everything that had been held apart for ages colliding in one apocalyptic moment. Odin rode straight for Fenrir. The great wolf saw him coming and opened its terrible jaws. They fought, All-Father against wolf, wisdom against hunger. But the prophecy held. Fenrir's jaws closed around Odin, and the leader of the Aesir, the wanderer who had sacrificed so much for knowledge, disappeared into darkness. The god who had hung himself on Yggdrasil to learn the runes, who had given his eye for wisdom, who had built the world from Ymir's corpse. He died in an instant, swallowed whole by the wolf he had feared for so long. But Vidar, Odin's son, saw his father fall. He ran forward and stepped into Fenrir's lower jaw. He wore a boot made from all the leather scraps that shoemakers had been gathering for ages for precisely this purpose, and gripped the wolf's upper jaw with his hands. With strength born of rage and grief, he tore Fenrir's jaws apart, ripping the great wolf in half, avenging his father even as the father's body was destroyed. Thor found what he'd been seeking for so long: Jormungandr, the world serpent, the creature he'd almost killed when fishing with Hymir. They met in battle, god and serpent, hammer and venom. Thor fought magnificently, striking blow after blow with Mjolnir, each impact shattering portions of the serpent's skull, breaking teeth, cracking scales. Finally, he delivered a blow so powerful that Jormungandr died, the massive body collapsing, shaking the earth in its death throes. But Thor had been fighting in the serpent's venom spray for the entire battle. His clothes were soaked with poison, his skin burned, his lungs filled with toxic fumes. He managed to stagger 9 steps away from the serpent's corpse before he collapsed and died, killed by the very creature he'd defeated. The protector of Asgard and Midgard, the giant slayer, the most physically powerful of the gods, dead from poison mere moments after his greatest victory. Tyr and Garmr, the hound of hell, fought to mutual destruction. The one-handed god and the monstrous dog killed each other simultaneously, dying in a tangle of teeth and blade, neither willing to yield, both too stubborn to retreat. Heimdall and Loki, the watchman and the trickster, finally settled accounts. They'd hated each other for ages, Heimdall representing order and vigilance, Loki representing chaos and transgression. Now they killed each other, Heimdall's sword through Loki's heart, Loki's blade through Heimdall's throat, falling together, dying together, their blood mixing on the scorched ground. Freyr faced Surtur weaponless, having given away his sword long ago. He fought with a stag's antler, with whatever he could find, but antlers don't stop fire giants. Surtur's flaming sword cut him down, and the god of prosperity and peace died in flames, his magic unable to save him from the very thing he'd been protecting the world against. The Einherjar fought valiantly, as they'd been training to do, but they were vastly outnumbered. For every frost giant they killed, 3 remained. For every soldier of hell they cut down, 10 more pressed forward. The chosen warriors died as warriors, weapons in hand, but they died nonetheless, one by one, their final battle ending not in victory but in annihilation. Bifrost, that rainbow bridge connecting the worlds, shattered under the weight of so many armies crossing it. The beautiful architecture that had stood for ages cracked, splintered, and fell into the void, severing the last easy connection between Asgard and the other realms. Yggdrasil, already weakened by Enchidurus gnawing and the stags eating, began to burn. Searcher's flames reached it, and the world tree, the axis of the cosmos, the structure holding everything together, caught fire. Its leaves blackened and fell. Its branches cracked and crashed down. Its roots withered in the heat. The tree that had connected 9 worlds, that had been tended daily by the Norns, that had stood since the beginning. It burned. And as it burned, everything connected to it began to collapse. The 9 worlds lost their structure. The boundaries between realms dissolved. Fire and ice met and consumed each other. The earth itself split open, mountains crumbling, valleys disappearing. The carefully ordered geography that the gods had created from Ymir's body simply coming apart. Searcher, having killed Freyr, having destroyed so many, turned his attention to Asgard itself. He raised his flaming sword high and brought it down on the realm of the gods. The golden halls that had seemed eternal, Valhalla, Gladsheim, Sessrumnir, all of them, burst into flame. The walls that had protected the Aesir for ages crumbled. Everything the gods had built, every hall and treasure and carefully maintained structure, burned in moments. The ocean rose as Jormungandr's death released its coils pressure on the world. Massive waves crashed over what remained of the continents, drowning the land, extinguishing some fires only to reveal more destruction beneath. Water and fire fought each other, leaving nothing but steam and ruin. The few humans who had survived the Fimbulvetcher, who had huddled together hoping to outlast the winter, died now in the apocalypse. Some were drowned, some burned, some crushed by falling mountains. Some simply froze in the darkness with no sun or moon to provide even minimal warmth. Midgard, the middle realm that had been carefully protected and blessed, became uninhabitable, a waste of fire and ice and flood that in the darkness. Complete darkness with no celestial bodies remaining. There was no way to tell how long the destruction lasted. Time itself seemed to break down along with everything else. But eventually the fires burned themselves out. The floods receded. The earthquakes stilled. The armies were destroyed, gods and giants and dead all killed or scattered. The battlefield of VGRR was covered in corpses. Weapons, shattered shields, broken helmets, blood mixing with ash and mud. Silence settled over the ruins. Not peaceful silence, but the silence of ending, of everything that had been loud and vital and alive simply ceasing. The 9 worlds were gone, or so damaged they might as well be gone. The gods were dead or scattered. The humans were gone. The carefully maintained order had been replaced by chaos and then by stillness. And in that stillness, in that absolute ending, the prophecy reached its completion. Everything the Norns had carved had come to pass. Everything Odin had feared and prepared for had happened exactly as foreseen. Knowledge had been powerless to prevent it. Strength had been insufficient to resist it. The end had come, as inevitable as the sunrise once was, back when there was still a sun to rise. The cosmos the gods had built from Ymir's corpse, maintained through sacrifice and oath, defended with hammer and spear, blessed with poetry and magic. All of it was gone, reduced to silence, darkness, and ruin. This was Ragnarok. This was the breaking, and it seemed absolute. But even endings are not absolute in the Norse cosmos. Even in total darkness, even after apocalypse, something persists. The prophecy didn't end with destruction. It continued, whispered by the Volva to Odin before she returned to death, speaking of what would come after. The earth, drowned and burned, began to rise again from the sea. Slowly, as if reluctant, the land emerged. Green this time, not scorched, not frozen. Grass grew without being planted. Trees sprouted without being seeded. Water flowed clear in new rivers, no longer poisoned by Jormungandr's venom. The world was smaller now, simpler, but it was there, solid beneath a sky that was somehow lighter even without sun or moon yet restored. And then, miraculously, the sun returned. Not Sol. She had been devoured by Skoll, but her daughter, born before the final battle, who now took up her mother's journey across the sky. This new sun was gentler somehow, its light softer, but it was enough. Day and night returned. The seasons would turn again. Life could return. Some gods survived. Not many, but enough. Vidar, who had avenged Odin by killing Fenrir, lived through the fires and floods. Vali, another of Odin's sons, also survived. From the sea came Mi and Magni, Thor's sons, carrying their father's hammer Mjolnir, which they had retrieved from the battlefield. The hammer that had protected Asgard and Midgard for so long would continue, even if Thor himself was gone. Hr and Baldur emerged from Hel's realm. The blind god who had unknowingly killed his brother, and the bright god who had been killed, both returned from death. The mechanism of their return isn't clear in the surviving texts, but perhaps Hel released them, or perhaps death itself had been so disrupted by Ragnarok that its boundaries broke down. Regardless, they walked the new earth together, reconciled. The tragedy that had marked the beginning of the end somehow healed in the aftermath. These surviving gods, sometimes called the sons of the Aesir in the texts, gathered at Iavlor where Asgard once stood. The golden halls were gone, burned to nothing by Surtur's flames, but the location remained. They found pieces in the ruins, golden game pieces that the gods had used for entertainment before the destruction, now tarnished but intact. These pieces became symbols of continuity, proof that not everything was lost. They spoke of the old gods, remembering Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, the beauty of the world that had been. They recited the stories. Already the past was becoming mythology to them, tales of a previous age that seemed almost impossible from the perspective of this quiet, empty new world. But they remembered. That was crucial. Memory persisted even when the remembered had died. The runes, too, remained, carved on scattered stones, preserved in the memory of the surviving gods, the knowledge that Odin had hung 9 nights on Yggdrasil to obtain. It survived. The magic hadn't died with the gods. The power of words and symbols continued, ready to be used again by whoever learned them. In a place called Hodmimis Holt, the forest of Hodmimi, 2 humans had survived the destruction. Their names were Lif and Lefraser, meaning life and eager for life. While Surtur's fires raged and the floods drowned the world, these 2 had hidden in the world tree itself, protected by Yggdrasil's wood even as it burned. They emerged now, hungry but alive, to find a world emptied of humanity except for themselves. They were the new Ask and Embla, the ancestors of a second human race. They found food growing. The earth was fertile now, almost preternaturally so, as if the destruction had enriched rather than depleted it. They would have children, and their children would have children, and slowly humanity would spread across the renewed earth. But this humanity would be different, born after the apocalypse, carrying no direct memory of the world before. Lif and Lefraser had memories, of course. They had lived in the old world, survived the Fimbulvetcher, hidden during Ragnarok. They could tell their children stories about the gods, about the way things had been, about the great winter and the final battle. But it would already be legend to the next generation, tales told around fires rather than lived experience. The break between old and new was real, even if some knowledge crossed it. The new world was strangely empty. No giants emerged from Jotunheim. Either they'd all died in the battle, or they were keeping to themselves, no longer interested in conflict now that the gods who had opposed them were mostly gone. The fire giants had returned to Muspelheim, if any survived. The frost giants remained in Niflheim, if that realm still existed in the same way. The boundaries were different now, less rigid or perhaps just less relevant. There were no dwarfs visible, though presumably they still existed in their underground halls, forging and crafting away from the surface world. No light elves appeared from Alfheim. The 9 worlds, if they still numbered 9, were disconnected now, without Yggdrasil to bind them together, without Bifrost to provide passage. Each realm had become more isolated, more independent. The surviving gods didn't try to rebuild Asgard as it had been. They didn't construct golden halls or high walls. Instead, they seemed content to live more simply, to meet at Iavlor, to remember and to plan, but not to recreate the structures that had failed. Perhaps they understood that the old system, for all its glory, had been flawed, built on violence at the beginning with Ymir's murder, maintained through constant conflict with giants, destined to end in apocalypse from the moment the Norns carved it. This new age felt provisional, temporary, as if the cosmos was resting, recovering, not yet ready to fully define itself. The urgency was gone. The pressure of prophecy was lifted. Ragnarok had happened, the doom foretold had come to pass, and now there was simply time. Open time, unfaded time, time that didn't lead inevitably toward destruction. Some pieces of the old world turned up in unexpected places. A sword here, a shield there, treasures that had somehow survived the fires and floods. Each one was a connection to the past, a physical reminder that the previous age had been real, not just a story. The surviving gods collected these items carefully, treating them as sacred relics. Poetry continued because me and Magni remembered it, because the runes persisted, because humans needed to make sense of their experience through language that carried weight and beauty. The first skalds of the New Age composed verses about the destruction, creating the very myths that would be passed down through generations, that would eventually be written down in Iceland centuries later, that would survive to the present day. The moral framework survived too, though adapted to new circumstances. Honor still mattered, though there were fewer people to honor and be honored by. Oaths still bound, though there were fewer gods to witness them. Hospitality remained sacred, perhaps more so now when humans were so few and far between. The values hadn't died with the gods, they'd been human values all along, modeled by the gods but belonging to humanity. Interestingly, the survivors didn't seem to mourn intensely, or perhaps they mourned privately, in ways the sources don't record. But the emphasis in the texts is on renewal, on looking forward rather than dwelling on loss. This might reflect Norse attitudes toward death generally. Grief was acceptable, even expected, but prolonged despair was not. The living had to keep living. The new world had to be inhabited, cultivated, made meaningful. Lif and Lefraceres' first children would never see a giant. They would never watch the Valkyries ride. They would never hear Thor's thunder or see Bifrost shimmer in the sky. The world they inherited was smaller, quieter, emptied of divine drama. But it was also free of the doom that had haunted the previous age. These children would not grow up knowing the world would end, that their gods would die, that everything would burn and drown and collapse. The world tree, or something like it, began to grow again, a young ash sprouting from the ruins of Yggdrasil's roots. It would take ages to reach the size and significance of its predecessor, if it ever did, but the symbol was clear. The axis could be restored, connections could be rebuilt, structure could return without requiring the exact replication of what was lost. Water from the old wells still flowed somewhere, feeding the new tree, carrying forward the wisdom and fate from the previous age. The Norns might still be there, carving new fates for this new cosmos, or perhaps the function of fate weaving had changed, become less deterministic, more open to chance and choice. What remained, ultimately, was possibility. The survivors stood in a world that was both familiar and utterly new, carrying memories of what had been while facing an uncertain future. They had knowledge, practical, magical, historical, that could help them avoid the mistakes of the past. They had tools, both physical and conceptual. They had each other, few as they were. And they had the stories. Even in the immediate aftermath, the destruction was already becoming narrative, being shaped into accounts that would explain what happened and why, that would preserve the names and deeds of the gods, that would transmit wisdom across the break between ages. This is what persisted when everything else fell. Memory, narrative, values, a handful of survivors, and a world that could support life again. Not much, perhaps, compared to the magnificent cosmos that had been destroyed, but enough, just barely enough to begin again. Norse mythology, as a lived religion, did not survive Ragnarok in the real world. It faded gradually, not in an apocalyptic battle, but under the slow, persistent pressure of a new faith, Christianity. Yet the myths didn't vanish. They slipped into other shapes, hid in poems and place names, reappeared in art, resurfaced in stories told long after people stopped sacrificing at groves or swearing oaths to Thor. Imagine the North Sea in the 9th or 10th century. A longship cuts through gray waves, heading for a monastery on some foreign shore. On board, men who still call on Odin and Thor, still wear hammer amulets under their tunics, prepare to do what their gods expect of them. Raid, fight, win glory, bring back silver and slaves and stories. Their cosmology gives meaning to this life. They know that if they die with weapons in hand, the Valkyries might come. Now imagine a few generations later. Another ship, another crew, but this time many of them are baptized. A wooden cross hangs where a hammer once did. A priest stands at the prow, muttering Latin prayers. The old gods aren't openly invoked anymore. But in the evenings, when the priest sleeps and the men sit around a small fire on deck, someone starts a story about Thor fishing for the world serpent, or about Loki's tricks, or about Odin hanging on the tree. The line between religion and story blurs. The gods become characters, not deities. The rituals fade, but the narratives remain. Christianization in Scandinavia was a slow, uneven process from roughly the 10th to the 12th centuries. Kings converted for political reasons, alliances, legitimacy from Christian Europe, access to trade. Once rulers embraced the new faith, they pushed it downward. Laws against pagan sacrifice, churches built on old holy sites, Christian festivals mapped onto older seasonal celebrations. But people don't abandon their cosmologies overnight. For generations, Norse beliefs and Christian teachings coexisted in a kind of uneasy blend. Farmers might attend church on Sunday and still leave offerings at a local rock or grove. A warrior might pray to Christ before battle and still mutter a quick word to Thor. The afterlife became crowded. Heaven and hell layered on top of Valhalla, hell, and Rance Hall beneath the sea. The old gods began to change in people's minds. Odin, once all-father, became a kind of ghostly wanderer, an old man in a cloak seen on lonely roads, associated with storms and the wild hunt. Thor became a half-remembered thunder spirit, his hammer turned into a Christian cross in some stories, a demon's weapon in others. Loki became easier to identify with the Christian devil. Trickster, tempter, enemy of the divine order. Officially, the old myths were condemned as lies or at best as old stories unfit for Christian souls. Unofficially, they survived wherever stories were told for pleasure, wherever grandfathers sat with grandchildren and filled long winter evenings with tales of giants and dragons and brave ancestors who fought with the help of gods. In Iceland, something remarkable happened. There, a Christian chieftain and scholar named Snorri Sturluson lived in the early 13th century. Snorri was a politician, poet, and historian. He loved the old skaldic poetry, but that poetry was dense with mythological references, kennings that didn't make sense unless you knew the stories behind them. If someone said Odin's steed, they meant Sleipnir, which meant you had to know the tale of Odin's eight-legged horse, which meant you had to know quite a lot, actually. Snorri realized that as Christianity took firmer hold, the younger generations were losing the mythological framework needed to understand their own literary tradition. So he did something quietly radical. He wrote the myths down. His prose Edda is half handbook for poets, half mythological encyclopedia. It opens with a kind of Christianized preface, explaining the gods as deified humans or illusions, but soon slips into rich, detailed retellings of creation, the war between Aesir and Vanir, Baldur's death, Loki's tricks, Ragnarok, and renewal. Snorri wasn't trying to revive the old faith. He was preserving its stories as cultural heritage and as a toolkit for poetry. Around the same time, an anonymous scribe in Iceland copied an older collection of mythic and heroic poems now called the Poetic Edda. These verses, like Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy, and Havamal, the sayings of Odin, are some of the most haunting texts in world literature. They preserved not just narrative outlines but the emotional and philosophical core of the mythic tradition. Fatalism, courage, the value of reputation, the fragility of life. Through these texts, Norse mythology gained an afterlife very different from the one its original believers might have imagined. No longer living religion, it became literature, history, source material, open to reinterpretation in every age. Medieval Christian writers often treated the Norse gods as examples of heathen error or as entertaining curiosities. Renaissance scholars cataloged them alongside Greek and Roman deities. In Romantic Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries, poets and painters rediscovered them with enthusiasm. The idea of a rugged, doom-aware northern spirit, facing a harsh world without the gentle consolations of classical harmony, appealed intensely. Richard Wagner's operas in the 19th century drew heavily, but loosely, from Norse and Germanic myth, turning gods and heroes into grand, tragic figures on stage. His Wotan owes as much to Odin as to literary invention. Siegfried echoes Sigurd from the Volsunga saga. The ring cycle fictionalized and distorted the sources, but it also planted some Norse themes deep in European cultural memory. Cursed rings, world-ending fires, gods walking knowingly toward doom at the same time. Nationalists in places like Norway and Germany looked to Viking and Norse myth as a well of identity. Sometimes this was harmless pride in cultural heritage. Other times it veered into dangerous racial myth-making, projecting modern ideologies backward onto ancient stories. In the 20th century, far-right movements twisted Norse symbols, runes, hammers, even Yggdrasil, into emblems of exclusion and supremacy. That legacy still complicates how these myths are used and perceived today. Yet the myths also inspired gentler, more imaginative afterlives. J.R.R. Tolkien, a scholar of Old Norse, filled his Middle-earth with echoes. Elves and dwarfs drawn from Eddic descriptions, a world tree-like cosmology, names like Gandalf and Durin pulled straight from ancient lists. He didn't retell Norse myths directly, but he absorbed their mood. Heroism in the face of certain loss, the beauty of things faded to past. In the later 20th and 21st centuries, Norse mythology became pop culture. Comics and movies turned Thor and Loki into superheroes and charismatic antiheroes. Video games let players wander through reimagined 9 worlds, fight Jormungandr, visit Asgard, and hear Mimir's talking head offer commentary. Novels, from Neil Gaiman's American Gods and Norse mythology to countless fantasy series, have recast Odin, Freya, and others for modern audiences. And these retellings, some elements get amplified, others softened. Loki becomes more sympathetic, less monstrous. Thor's simplicity becomes endearing. Odin's manipulations become more morally ambiguous, sometimes framed as abusive. Ragnarok often becomes a metaphor, not a literal end of the world, but a personal or cultural catastrophe that clears the ground for change. Meanwhile, in small corners of the modern world, some people have tried to revive Norse religion itself. Under names like Asatru or Heat Henry, They reconstruct rituals, blots, and seasonal festivals from the scattered evidence we have. They raise drinking horns, swear oaths, honor gods and ancestors. Some approaches are inclusive and thoughtful. Others unfortunately inherit or invent the old nationalist and racist distortions. The myths, being powerful, attract both kinds. But even outside formal revival, Norse myths echo quietly in everyday life. In English, Wednesday, Woden's Day, preserves Odin. Thursday, Thor's Day, honors the thunder god. Friday, Freya's or Frigg's Day, remembers a goddess. Place names across Scandinavia and the British Isles recall Thor, Odin, and J.R.R. Trees called world trees appear in modern fantasy. Tattoos of Mjolnir, ravens, wolves, and runes are etched on skins around the globe. The legacy isn't just in symbols, though. It's in ideas that even gods are bound by fate, that courage matters more than guaranteed success, that reputation can outlast death, that the world might end not in moral judgment but in indifferent catastrophe, and that meaning must be made anyway. Those ideas have seeped into modern existentialism, into the way some people talk about climate change, nuclear war, or societal collapse. Ragnarok as metaphor for any overwhelming, inevitable crisis. Strangely, Christianity itself may have helped preserve Norse myth. Had Scandinavia remained pagan, the stories might have evolved, fragmented, or disappeared without being written down. The arrival of literacy, monasteries, and scholars like Snorri created a snapshot of the myths at a particular moment in time. Yes, the snapshot is colored by Christian assumptions, but it exists. Without it, we might know almost nothing. So the afterlife of Norse mythology is complex. It's a body of literature studied in universities. It's a toolbox for fantasy creators. It's a reservoir of symbols claimed by very different groups for very different reasons. It's a fragmentary but precious record of how one culture understood the world. The gods are no longer worshipped by entire nations. No sacrifices smoke up from groves in their honor. But in 1,000 quiet ways, they're still with us. On pages, screens, in songs, in metaphors we barely notice, in names and days and half-remembered stories. In that sense, Odin got his wish. He wanted to be remembered, to have knowledge and name endure beyond his own death. And here we are, centuries later, still telling his story, still talking about his one eye, his ravens, his hanging on the tree, his doomed march toward Fenrir. The old world ended. The belief structure collapsed. But the stories found new homes in minds, in books, in art. That is the true afterlife and legacy of Norse mythology. Not eternal divine rule, but enduring narrative power. For centuries after Christianization, the Norse myths slept in manuscripts scattered across Iceland and Denmark, written in a language fewer and fewer people could read. Old Norse became the province of scholars, dusty parchments in church archives and private libraries, curiosities that occasionally caught the attention of antiquarians but rarely sparked wider interest. The stories sat dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right cultural conditions to wake again. That moment came gradually, beginning in the 17th century when European scholars started taking medieval Icelandic texts seriously as historical and literary documents. Men like the Icelander Arngrimur Jonsson and later the Danish antiquarian Ole Worm began collecting manuscripts, translating passages, trying to piece together what pre-Christian Scandinavia had actually believed and practiced. In 1643, a manuscript surfaced that would change everything. The Codex Regius, containing most of what we now call the Poetic Edda. It had been sitting in a farmhouse in Iceland, survived by luck and the dry Icelandic climate. Bishop Brynjolfur Sveinsson recognized its importance and sent it to the King of Denmark. Scholars pored over it, marveling at the ancient verses about gods and heroes, death and rebirth, wisdom and doom. Around the same time, Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda was being studied more carefully. Together, these texts provided the foundation for reconstructing Norse mythology. But reconstruction is interpretation. Scholars had to decide what to emphasize, how to organize scattered stories, which contradictions to smooth over and which to preserve. The mythology that emerged from these scholarly efforts wasn't identical to what Vikings believed. Couldn't be. Too much was lost, and every translator and interpreter brought their own assumptions. The 18th century Enlightenment treated Norse myths with a mix of fascination and condescension. Rational philosophers saw them as examples of primitive thinking, colorful but ultimately inferior to Greek and Roman mythology, let alone Christian truth. Yet there was also growing interest in northern antiquities as part of national heritage. Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark and Sweden, wanted their own classical past to rival the Mediterranean cultures everyone else celebrated. Then came Romanticism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and everything changed. Romantic poets, artists, and philosophers valued emotion over reason, the wild over the cultivated, the mysterious over the explained. Norse mythology fit perfectly. Here were gods who weren't serene and immortal but passionate, flawed, doomed. Here was a cosmos not of eternal order but of inevitable twilight. Here were heroes who fought knowing they'd lose. German romantics, in particular, embraced Norse themes. Jacob Grimm, yes, one of the brothers Grimm, wrote extensively on Germanic mythology, connecting Norse gods to broader Germanic traditions. His Deutsche Mythology, 1835, attempted to reconstruct a pan-Germanic belief system, drawing on everything from Eddic poems to folklore to linguistic evidence. This was pioneering scholarship, but also shaped by nationalist desires to find ancient roots for modern German identity. Richard Wagner took this further. His Ring Cycle operas, 1848 to 1874, reimagined Norse and Germanic mythology as grand tragic drama. Wagner's Wotan, Odin, broods over the coming end, schemes and manipulates, and ultimately accepts destruction. His vision was powerful, beautiful, and enormously influential, but it was also Wagner's invention as much as reconstruction. Audiences who saw the Ring Cycle often thought they were seeing authentic myth when they were actually seeing 19th century German opera dressed in ancient costume. Unfortunately, this 19th century embrace of Norse imagery also fed into darker currents. As European nations competed for power and prestige, they often justified themselves through invented racial hierarchies. Norse mythology became entangled with ideas about Nordic or Aryan purity and superiority. This reached its horrifying apex in Nazi Germany, which appropriated runes, Norse symbolism, and mythic language for its ideology of racial domination. The Nazis didn't care about historical accuracy. They cherry-picked and distorted. Odin became a warrior god of conquest rather than a complex seeker of wisdom. The warrior ethos was exaggerated while the cosmology's fatalism and complexity were ignored. SS units adopted rune insignias. Scholars were pressured to emphasize Germanic superiority. This poisoned Norse mythology for generations, associating it in many minds with fascism and racism. After World War II, scholars had to reclaim the myths from this toxic legacy. This meant being very careful about how they presented and interpreted the material, avoiding nationalist or racialist readings, emphasizing historical context and textual complexity. It also meant acknowledging what we don't know, the gaps, contradictions, and biases in our sources. Modern scholarship has revealed just how fragmentary our knowledge is. We have the poetic Edda and prose Edda, but how representative are they? Were these mainstream beliefs or regional variations? How much did Snorri's Christian perspective shape his presentation? How much did Icelandic culture, isolated and distinctive, preserve versus transform older Norwegian and Swedish traditions? Archaeological evidence helps fill some gaps. Excavations at sites like Uppsala in Sweden, Lidra in Denmark, and Sonda in Norway have uncovered temple remains, sacrificial deposits, and grave goods that shed light on actual practices. We find Thor's hammer amulets in graves, suggesting his popularity. We find elaborate ship burials, confirming the connection between death, voyage, and status. We find evidence of animal sacrifice, ritual feasting, and offerings thrown into bogs. Rune stones across Scandinavia carry brief inscriptions, some referencing gods or mythic events. Place names preserve divine names. Odense, Odin's sanctuary; Torshalla, Thor's rock; Frozen, Frey's island. These traces confirm that the myths weren't just literary invention but connected to lived religious practice. Yet interpretation remains challenging. Take the Volvas, the female seers who practiced seer magic. The sources describe them, but often with hostility or sensationalism. Were they respected religious specialists or marginalized figures? Was seer shamanic trance, herbalism, performance, or something we can't quite categorize? Scholars debate intensely, bringing anthropology, gender studies, and comparative religion to bear on fragmentary texts. The question of human sacrifice is similarly contentious. Some sources, like Adam of Bremen's account of Uppsala, describe human sacrifices hanging in sacred groves. Archaeological finds like the Talon man and other bog bodies suggest ritual killing. But how common was it? Under what circumstances? The evidence is disturbing but incomplete, and scholars must avoid both sanitizing Norse religion into something palatable and exaggerating its brutality for sensational effect. Modern interpretations also grapple with gender. The myths feature powerful goddesses like Freya and complex female figures like the Valkyries and Norns. Yet the texts were recorded by Christian men, often in societies that restricted women's roles. How much do our sources reflect actual Norse attitudes toward gender, and how much do they reflect medieval scribes' biases? Recent scholarship has tried to recover women's religious roles, examining archaeological evidence of female graves with magical implements, studying the Volva tradition, and reading myths for what they reveal about female power and agency. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen an explosion of popular interest in Norse mythology. Fantasy literature from Tolkien onward has drawn heavily on Norse elements. The Marvel Cinematic Universe turned Thor and Loki into globally recognizable characters, though vastly transformed from their original contexts. Video games like God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla let players interact with Norse settings and characters, often blending historical elements with dramatic invention. These pop culture versions have introduced millions to Norse mythology who might never read the Eddas. That's powerful and democratic, but it also creates confusion. Many people think they know Norse mythology when they actually know Marvel's version or some other adaptation. Scholars and enthusiasts often find themselves explaining, well, actually, in the original sources, there's also a modern revival movement. Various groups practice reconstructed Norse paganism under names like Asatru, Heat Henry, or Forn Sur. They hold rituals, celebrate seasonal festivals, honor the gods and ancestors, and try to live by values they extract from the sources. Some are inclusive, welcoming people of all backgrounds who feel drawn to these traditions. Others, unfortunately, promote exclusivist or racialist interpretations, claiming Norse religion belongs only to people of Scandinavian descent. This tension between those who see Norse mythology as universal heritage open to all and those who claim it as ethnic property mirrors broader cultural debates about identity, appropriation, and tradition. Scholars generally argue that mythology belongs to humanity, that ancient stories can speak across time and culture, and that racist readings fundamentally misunderstand the sources, which show Norse peoples in contact with diverse cultures from the Mediterranean to the Middle East. What surprises modern scholars most? Perhaps how much humor there is in the myths. Loki dressing as a bride to retrieve Thor's hammer. Thor eating so much at a giant's feast he nearly drains the ocean. Odin's constant disguises and trickery. The sources aren't solemn religious texts, they're often funny, earthy, strange. This suggests the original believers had a complex relationship with their gods. respectful but not subservient, faithful but not uncritical. Another surprise, how little dogma there was. No Norse Bible existed, no centralized church, no official theology. Beliefs varied by region, by family, by individual. Some emphasized Thor, others Freyr, others Odin. The myths themselves contain contradictions, different versions of the same story, conflicting genealogies, puzzling details. This wasn't sloppiness. It was the nature of oral tradition and decentralized belief. Modern debates continue about fundamental questions. Was Ragnarok always part of the mythology, or did it develop later, possibly influenced by Christian ideas of apocalypse? Were the Assurvanir war and integration historical memory of actual religious conflicts, or purely mythic? How literally did people believe these stories? Were they understood as metaphor, as history, as both? We still don't know. We probably never will with certainty. What we have are texts, archaeology, linguistic traces, and comparative evidence from other cultures. From these fragments, scholars reconstruct, interpret, and argue. Each generation brings new questions and tools. Feminist readings, post-colonial critiques, cognitive science approaches, digital humanities methods. And the myths keep yielding new meanings. In an age of climate crisis, Ragnarok resonates as ecological apocalypse. In discussions of toxic masculinity, the complexities of Norse gender roles, warrior women, magic-practicing Odin, Loki's gender fluidity become relevant. In a time of political polarization, the myth's embrace of moral ambiguity and tragic heroism offers alternatives to simple good versus evil narratives. The rediscovery continues because the myths are never fully discovered. They remain partially hidden, partially invented, partially misunderstood, but endlessly fascinating. Each person who encounters them, whether through scholarly study or a Marvel movie, adds another layer of interpretation to an already thick palimpsest of meaning. So what does it all mean? After you've walked through creation and destruction, met gods and giants, witnessed golden ages and apocalypses, traced the myths through death and revival and modern reinterpretation, what patterns emerge? What truths, if any, live at the heart of these strange, violent, beautiful stories? Start with the most obvious. Norse mythology is relentlessly honest about endings. Unlike traditions that promise eternal heavens or infinite cycles of rebirth, the Norse cosmos acknowledges that everything, including the gods themselves, will eventually cease. Ragnarok isn't punishment for sin or cosmic accident. It's simply what's coming, carved by the Norns, inevitable as winter following fall. This isn't nihilism, though. It's something more nuanced. The gods know they're doomed, yet they build anyway. They create beauty, establish order, protect what they love, knowing it's temporary. Odin gathers his army for a battle he knows he'll lose. Thor protects Midgard even though Midgard will eventually drown. They act with full knowledge of futility. There's a word for this that doesn't quite exist in English but pulses through the myths. The idea that meaning comes not from outcomes but from the manner of facing the inevitable. You can't control fate, but you can control how you meet it. Die well, fight hard, keep your oaths, maintain your honor. These aren't guarantees of victory. They're ways of asserting human or divine dignity against an indifferent universe. This speaks to something universal. Every human faces mortality. Every civilization knows it will eventually fall. Every relationship, every achievement, every beautiful thing we make will one day end. The Norse response isn't to deny this or rage against it, but to ask, knowing this, how should we live? Another pattern. The cosmos is built on sacrifice and exchange. The world itself comes from Ymir's sacrificed body. Odin hangs on Yggdrasil, sacrificing himself to gain the runes. He gives his eye for wisdom. Tyr gives his hand to bind Fenrir. Freyr gives away his sword for love. Again and again, Something valuable must be surrendered to gain something else. This reflects the transactional nature of Norse religion, sacrifice to gods in exchange for blessings, but it goes deeper. It suggests that nothing worthwhile comes free, that all growth requires loss, that wisdom costs pieces of yourself you can never get back. Odin's missing eye isn't a disability to be overcome. It's the permanent mark of what he paid for knowledge. The sacrifice is the point, not an unfortunate side effect. Modern self-help culture often promises growth without pain, success without sacrifice, wisdom without cost. Norse mythology offers no such comfort. Want to learn the runes? Hang yourself for 9 nights. Want to bind the wolf that threatens the world? Lose your hand. Want poetry itself? Steal it through seduction, shape-shifting, and risk. Everything has a price, and the price is usually high. The myths also reveal deep ambivalence about civilization and order. The gods create structure, laws, boundaries, all the things that separate cosmos from chaos. But that structure is fragile, constantly threatened, and eventually doomed. The giants, representing wild nature and chaos, are enemies but also kin, lovers, sometimes necessary allies. You can't simply destroy chaos. It's woven into the family tree. Loki embodies this tension most clearly. He's Odin's blood brother, living in Asgard, helping the gods repeatedly. But he's also a giant, ultimately hostile, the one who triggers Ragnarok. The gods need him until they don't, tolerate him until they can't. And when they finally bind him, the cosmos begins its final unraveling. Chaos can't be eliminated, and trying to control it completely backfires. This speaks to a perennial human struggle. We want order, safety, predictability, but we also need wildness, creativity, transgression. Too much order becomes sterile and brittle. Too much chaos becomes destructive. The gods try to balance this by keeping Loki close but contained, until that balance fails and everything falls apart. Gender in these myths is more fluid and complex than popular stereotypes suggest. Yes, there are masculine warrior gods like Thor and Tyr, but Odin practices Seer, a form of magic associated with women, which brings him scorn from other gods. Loki shapeshifts into female form repeatedly, gives birth to Sleipnir after becoming a mare. Freya is simultaneously goddess of love and goddess of war, choosing half the battle dead. The Valkyries are female warriors. The Norns, female figures, control fate itself. Strength comes in multiple forms. Thor's physical power, Odin's cunning and knowledge, Freya's magic and sexuality, Loki's shapeshifting and trickery. No single form of power dominates absolutely. The most powerful god, Odin, can't save himself from Fenrir. The strongest god, Thor, dies from poison. Power is always partial, always limited, always insufficient alone. This multiplicity of power types might reflect actual Norse society, where women could own property, divorce, practice Volva magic, and wield real authority in their spheres even while being excluded from other forms of power. Or it might reflect storytelling that recognized diverse audience members and their different fantasies and fears. Either way, the myths don't present a simple gender binary or hierarchy. Another recurring theme, knowledge is dangerous but necessary. Odin's entire character centers on this tension. He craves knowledge obsessively, pays terrible prices for it, and yet the knowledge doesn't save him. He learns about Ragnarok in detail, but he can't prevent it. The Volvas he consults tell him exactly how he'll die, and he marches toward that death anyway. Why seek knowledge if it doesn't grant control? Because not knowing is worse. Because understanding, even of terrible things, has its own value. Because the alternative to grasping for wisdom is accepting ignorance. And for Odin, that's unthinkable. His character suggests that consciousness itself, awareness, understanding, the ability to see patterns and consequences, is worth having even when it brings pain. This resonates in a modern world flooded with information, much of it disturbing. We know about climate change, biodiversity loss, political dysfunction, looming crises. We can't unknow these things, and knowing doesn't give us easy solutions. But like Odin, we keep seeking more knowledge, driven by the belief that understanding is somehow essential to being fully human, even when it doesn't prevent disaster. The myths also explore reputation as a kind of immortality. Since everyone dies and even gods face doom, what survives? Your name, your deeds, the stories told about you. This is why Odin wants skalds in his hall, why warriors seek glorious deaths, why oath-breaking is so shameful, because reputation outlasts the body, and to be forgotten or remembered poorly is the real death. In our age of social media and cancel culture, this obsession with reputation feels uncomfortably relevant. We live in a surveillance society where everything you do might be recorded, where your brand matters, where public shaming can destroy lives. The Norse weren't quite that extreme, but they understood that social death preceded and sometimes mattered more than physical death. Yet there's also humility woven through the myths. The gods are powerful but not all-powerful. They're wise but not all-knowing. They're immortal but not eternal. They make mistakes, get tricked, lose battles, fail to protect what they love. There's no omnipotent figure who can fix everything, no cosmic parent to appeal to when things go wrong. This forces responsibility downward. If the gods can't guarantee justice or prevent disaster, then humans and gods alike must act rightly for its own sake, not because reward is guaranteed. You keep your oaths because oaths should be kept, not because a god will punish oath-breakers in the afterlife. You fight bravely because courage matters, not because you'll definitely win. The renewal after Ragnarok introduces another layer. The world ends, but not permanently. Life returns. A new generation rises. This could be read as cyclical time, everything dies and is reborn, but it's not quite that simple. The new world isn't identical to the old one. Some gods return, others don't. It's not repetition but transformation, destruction that makes space for something different. Maybe this reflects agricultural cycles. Fields burned and replanted, herds culled and rebuilt, harsh winters followed by spring. Or maybe it reflects generational change. The old ways die, new people build new worlds on the ruins. Either way, it's a pattern of creative destruction, where catastrophe clears ground for possibility. This has obvious resonance today. Many feel we're living through or approaching our own Ragnarok. Environmental collapse, political breakdown, technological disruption that tears apart familiar structures. The myths suggest that such endings, while tragic and violent, aren't necessarily final. Something can survive. Not everything, not unchanged, but something. Lif and Lefracer hide in the tree. The runes persist. Memory survives to seed the next cycle. Finally, there's something almost existentialist about Norse mythology. The universe has no inherent meaning or purpose. The gods create order not because they're following some cosmic plan, but because they choose to. Humans create meaning through their actions, their relationships, their stories. Honor, courage, loyalty, these aren't objective truths written into reality, but values people construct and maintain because without them, life would be unbearable. When Odin faces Fenrir, when Thor fights Jormungandr, when the Einherjar charge into battle, they know they'll lose. They're choosing to act in a certain way despite knowing the outcome. That choice, that defiance, that insistence on behaving with honor even when honor won't save you, that's where meaning lies. In the myths viewed so, the patterns that emerge are these: mortality and impermanence as fundamental conditions, sacrifice as the price of anything worthwhile, knowledge as dangerous but necessary, reputation as social immortality, power as multiple and limited, order and chaos as necessarily entangled, endings that create space for beginnings, and meaning as something chosen, created, maintained through action rather than discovered in the structure of reality. These aren't comfortable truths. They don't offer easy hope or simple morals. but they offer something, a way of thinking about how to live with courage and dignity in a world that doesn't guarantee happy endings, where even the gods themselves are vulnerable, where everything you build will eventually fall, but still you build. We've traveled a long way together tonight. From Ginnungagap's yawning void to the fires of Ragnarok and beyond, through creation and destruction and the quiet renewal that followed. From Ymir's body becoming the world to Lif and Lofracer emerging to repopulate an earth cleansed by catastrophe. From golden halls in Asgard to the gray silence of Hel, from Odin's desperate quest for knowledge to Thor's simple, thundering protection of what he loved. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The world tree, Yggdrasil, with its roots reaching into wells of fate and memory, its branches stretching over all that exists, its trunk carved with destinies that gods and humans alike must fulfill. Picture the Norns, those three mysterious figures, drawing water each morning to nourish the tree, keeping the axis of reality alive for one more day. Picture the squirrel Ratatoskr running up and down, carrying insults, performing its small, absurd part in the cosmic machinery. There's something both grand and intimate about these myths, isn't there? They operate on the largest possible scale, the birth and death of entire worlds. Yet they never lose sight of individual experience, personal choice, the small moments that matter. A blind god throwing a dart, a goddess weeping for her son, a trickster cutting a sprig of mistletoe, a Volva speaking prophecy, a warrior dying well. The Norse who told and retold these stories weren't naive. They knew their lives were hard, their world dangerous, their gods flawed. They lived with cold that could kill, seas that could swallow ships, violence that could erupt without warning. They built their mythology to match their reality. Beautiful but brutal, ordered but fragile, meaningful but temporary. And yet they didn't despair. Or if they did, they didn't let despair have the final word. They told stories about gods who knew they were doomed and built golden halls anyway. About humans made from driftwood who stood up and created families, communities, laws, poetry. About the sun being chased every day but rising again every morning, until the day it didn't, and even then, her daughter took up the journey. What makes these myths continue to speak to us, more than 1,000 years after the last true believer made the last true sacrifice at the last sacred grove? Maybe it's their refusal to lie about hard things. They don't promise that good people will be rewarded or that justice will prevail or that there's a benevolent force ensuring happy endings. Instead they say, this is hard and you'll probably lose and you should try anyway. Die well, keep your word, protect what you can while you can. Make something beautiful even knowing it's temporary. There's a word in Norwegian that doesn't quite translate, dagenflu, literally dayfly, or what we call a mayfly in English. It's sometimes used as a metaphor for ephemeral things, things that live and die quickly. But the mayflies don't know they're temporary. They dance in the sun, mate, lay eggs, all with the same urgency and intensity as creatures that live for decades. Their brevity doesn't make them less real, less important, less worthy of existing. Maybe we're all mayflies from some cosmic perspective. Our civilizations, our achievements, our carefully maintained orders, they'll all end eventually, as surely as Asgard burned. But the myths suggest that's not a reason for nihilism. It's just context. Knowing you're temporary doesn't make you meaningless. It makes the choices you make, the way you live, the values you uphold. All of it matters more, not less, precisely because it's not guaranteed to last. Odin hanging on the tree for 9 nights to gain the runes wasn't trying to prevent Ragnarok. He knew he couldn't. He was trying to live fully, to know deeply, to experience consciousness at its most intense before the darkness came. And when the darkness did come, he rode toward it with his army, spear in hand, because that's who he'd chosen to be. The human stories. Ask and Embla given breath and thought, Lif and Lofracer surviving in the tree, suggest our role in this cosmos. We're not at the center. We're not the point. We're one small part of a vast interconnected web, but we're given the gift of awareness, the ability to create meaning, to form relationships, to act with intention. What we do with that gift is up to us. In our current moment, these old myths feel strangely prescient. We face our own Fimbulvetcher in various forms. Climate catastrophe, political disintegration, technological disruption, the unraveling of systems we thought were permanent. We watch bonds break that we assumed were unbreakable. We see institutions fail that seemed eternal. We hear prophecies of doom from scientists playing the role of vulvas, warning us what's coming. And like the gods, we have choices about how to respond. We can deny and pretend the warnings are false. We can despair and give up. Or we can do what Thor did, keep fighting. What Odin did, keep seeking knowledge even when it's painful. What the Einherjar did, train for a battle that matters even knowing the outcome is grim. What the Norns did, tend the tree each day because today it still stands. The renewal after Ragnarok isn't guaranteed in our world the way it was in the myth. But it is possible. Lif and Lefracer existed because the tree, even burning, sheltered them. What trees are we planting now? What knowledge are we preserving? What values are we teaching our children so that if they have to rebuild, they'll have something to build from? These aren't just abstract questions. They're what makes mythology matter beyond entertainment or academic study. The myths are technologies for thinking, frameworks for making sense of experiences that would otherwise overwhelm us. They give us language for talking about fate and freedom, order and chaos, death and persistence, loss and renewal. When you're facing something difficult, a loss, a failure, an ending, you can remember Baldur dying from mistletoe and the god's grief that shook the cosmos. You can remember that even the most beloved, the most protected, can fall. And you can remember that the world continued anyway, that there was still meaning even in the aftermath, that the story didn't end with the tragedy. When you're trying to decide whether to keep fighting for something that seems hopeless, you can remember the Einherjar training in Valhalla, knowing their final battle was doomed but training anyway because the manner of their fighting mattered. You can remember that courage isn't about guaranteed success. It's about choosing to act rightly regardless of outcome. When you're tempted to play it safe, to avoid sacrifice, to hoard what you have, you can remember Odin hanging on the tree, Tyr losing his hand, the constant theme that nothing worthwhile comes without cost. And you can ask yourself, what am I willing to pay? What sacrifice might buy something valuable? The myths don't give answers in the sense of step-by-step instructions. They're not self-help books, but they give something perhaps more useful. Perspectives, frameworks, permission to feel the weight of hard things while still choosing to accede so as this journey ends. As the sun we followed across the sky finally sets, as the fire burns low, as sleep tugs at the edges of consciousness, what remains? Memory remains. Story remains. The knowledge that others before us faced terrifying uncertainties and found ways to live with courage and meaning. The awareness that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a pattern that repeats across cultures and centuries. Creation, flourishing, decline, destruction, and the possibility, just the possibility, of renewal. The Norse gods are gone, if they ever existed outside story and ritual. Asgard burned. The Einherjar fell. But the myths persist, adapted and reinterpreted by each generation, still offering their stark, beautiful, challenging vision of how to face mortality, embrace sacrifice, seek knowledge, maintain honor, and create meaning in a cosmos that guarantees nothing except change. You're part of that chain now, having walked through these 15 parts, through the entire arc of Norse mythology. The stories live in you a little differently than they did before. Maybe you'll tell them to someone else someday, adding your own layer to the centuries of retelling. Maybe you'll just carry them quietly, letting them inform how you face your own battles, losses, and endings. Either way, you've done what humans have always done. Gathered by the fire, metaphorical or literal, to hear about gods and giants, creation and destruction, the way things were and the way things might be again. You've participated in one of our oldest technologies for making the unbearable bearable and the meaningless meaningful. The world tree still stands in imagination, in the spaces between words, in the structure of the stories we tell. Its roots reach into past and memory. Its branches stretch toward futures we can't quite see. And we're here at its trunk, carving our own small marks, adding to what the Norns have written, tending it as we can. Rest now. The stories will still be here tomorrow. The myths will wait, and perhaps, like Lif and Lefracer, will emerge into morning. Not unchanged, not guaranteed safety, but alive, aware, and ready to see what world needs making from the ruins and remnants of what came before. Thank you for listening, for staying through all these words, for letting these ancient, strange, beautiful myths occupy space in your mind for a while. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time of night it is, whatever you're facing in your own life, may you find in these stories what you need. May you die well when that time comes. May your reputation be good. May you face your own Ragnarok with courage. And may something of what matters to you survive into whatever comes next. Sleep well, friend. The myths are older than us and will outlast us. But for now, for this moment, we held them together, you and I. That's enough. That's everything. Good night.